Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the world outside grow quiet. Because this evening, we are drifting together back through 3,000 years to the ancient hills of Judea. Tonight, we'll wander through the story of King David, a shepherd boy sitting alone in the golden fields outside Bethlehem, a young man stepping into the long shadow of a giant, and a king growing old in a lamplit palace in Jerusalem, listening to the wind move through the cedar beams above him. This is his story, and it will carry you gently through the night. If you'd like to find these quiet stories waiting for you again tomorrow evening, a soft subscription here will always bring you back. And before you drift, we'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? You're joining a gentle community of tired souls, all resting together across this sleeping world. The light that falls on the hills of Judah has a particular quality to it, something ancient and unhurried, a warmth that seems to rise from the limestone itself as much as it descends from the sky above. In the long, dry months of summer, those hills glow with a pale, almost silver hue, the stone exposed and smoothed by centuries of wind and rain and the slow, patient passing of seasons. And the shadows that pool in the valleys below are soft and blue, gathering there like water finding its natural resting place. This is a landscape that does not rush. It is never rushed. It simply endures, quietly and with enormous patience, the way all ancient things endure. And it holds within its contours a history so deep and so layered that to walk there, even now, is to feel the ground pressing back against you with something like memory. The southern Levant, the land that stretches between the great desert to the east and the long, glittering edge of the Mediterranean to the west, sits at a particular crossroads of the ancient world, and it has always known this about itself. Great civilizations rose and traded and pressed their influence along its edges. Egypt lay to the southwest, a civilization of extraordinary age and power, its long reach felt in the form of trade goods and political pressure and the occasional passing of armies through these very hills. To the north, the cities of the coast and the valleys were enmeshed in networks of commerce and culture that connected them to Cyprus and to the Aegean and to the older worlds of Mesopotamia beyond. And yet the hill country of Judah, this rugged, stony, beautiful interior, remained in many ways its own world, shaped more by its geography than by the ambitions of distant empires, a world of terraced slopes and seasonal springs and the slow movement of flocks across land that had been grazed and tended for longer than any written record can reach. It is into this world that the story of David begins, and it is worth pausing here, resting in the landscape for a moment before the story itself begins to move, because the land is not merely a backdrop to what follows. It is something closer to a character in its own right. The hills of Judah made the people who lived among them in ways that are not always easy to articulate, but are always present in the traditions and the poetry that have come down to us from that time and place. The rhythms of pastoral life, the long vigilance of watching over animals in open country, the dependence on rain and the understanding of drought, the knowledge of paths and watercourses, and the behavior of wild things, all of this shaped the people of the Iron Age highlands in ways that would echo through their culture for generations. The period that historians place roughly from around 1,200 years before the Common Era onward, through the centuries that follow, was a time of significant change across the ancient Near East. Great Bronze Age powers had collapsed or contracted, trade networks had been disrupted, and in the wake of that disruption, smaller political units, city-states and tribal confederacies and emerging kingdoms had begun to fill the spaces left behind. In the highlands of Canaan, the population of settled villages appears to have grown during this period, with communities establishing themselves on hilltops and ridgelines, building in the local limestone, terracing the slopes for agriculture, learning to capture and store the precious winter rains in plastered cisterns cut into the rock below their feet. They were modest, practical, deeply local communities, and they were bound together not by the apparatus of a state, but by ties of kinship and custom and shared worship and the long common experience of surviving in difficult terrain. The year of David's birth is not something that can be stated with certainty, and historians debate the precise chronology at length, working from the texts that have come down to us, and from the evidence turned up by archaeologists in the layers of ancient sites across the region. The broad tradition places him somewhere in the early centuries of the first millennium before the Common Era, a child of the Iron Age highlands, born into the particular world of Judah, in a moment when the political landscape of the region was shifting and uncertain and full of the kind of turbulent energy that sometimes, in hindsight, turns out to have been the precondition for something lasting. But all of that comes later. At the beginning, there is only the landscape and the life it shaped. Imagine the year running its ancient course through these hills. In the autumn, the first rains would arrive after the long, dry heat of summer, falling on the parched limestone and releasing from the earth a smell of extraordinary richness and relief. The smell of dust becoming soil again, of seeds beginning to stir, of life resuming its slow, patient work. The farmers and herders of the hill country would feel those rains as something close to a reprieve, a confirmation that the cycle would continue, that the land had not forgotten its obligation to sustain them. The barley would be sown in the freshly turned earth, and the plowing would go on through the cooler months, and the terraced fields on the hillsides would hold the rain against the slope, coaxing a harvest from ground that would otherwise drain and dry too quickly. By winter, the hills would take on a brief and startling greenness, the kind of green that surprises you after the long silver and gold of summer, and the shepherds would move their flocks across this renewed pasture, following routes that had been followed for generations, reading the land for water and shade and shelter from the wind. The goats especially were well suited to this terrain, sure-footed on the steep paths, capable of finding sustenance in the sparse vegetation of the hillsides, and they moved through the landscape with a kind of casual confidence that must have seemed, to the people who watched over them, like a form of deep knowledge, an understanding of the land that had been learned over a very long time. Spring brought the wildflowers, the anemones and the cyclamens, and the tiny starred things that grew in the crevices of the rock, and the hillsides that had seemed all stone and severity would briefly soften and color, the light warming toward the long clarity of summer, and the almond trees would bloom along the valley edges, white and brave before any other tree had thought to stir. Then summer again, the slow drying, the grasses browning, the springs retreating, the sun bearing down with its full ancient weight, and the people and their animals adjusting, as they always did, as they had always done, to the patience that the land required of them. This is the world into which the boy at the center of our long, quiet story was born, a world of stone and light and seasonal water, of communal life in small settlements, of flocks and fields, and the slow movement of the year through its familiar passages. It was a world in which a person could know the landscape around them with an intimacy that is difficult to imagine now, in which every hillside and spring and ancient tree and shepherd's path was known by name and by use and by the particular quality of its presence in different weathers and different lights. The hills of Judah do not give up their secrets quickly, but to those who live among them long enough, who learn to move through them with patience and attention, they offer a kind of knowledge that goes very deep, a knowledge of how things endure, of what survives the long passage of time, of where, in the difficult and stony places, the water can still be found. Somewhere in those hills, in a particular village whose name has come down to us through 3,000 years of tradition and memory and retelling, a family was going about its ordinary life. The father's name, the story tells us, was Jesse, and he had sons, several of them, and fields to tend, and animals to keep, and the usual texture of a modest life in the Iron Age highlands of Judah. And the youngest of his sons, the one who is said to have been given the task of watching the flocks on the open hillsides, while his older brothers attended to the more visible business of the household, that youngest son was the one whose story has been carried across the centuries like a lamp passed carefully from hand to hand, its small flame somehow still burning. That village, that family, that youngest son, and the particular hills that surrounded him and shaped him, they are where we are headed, and there is no hurry to arrive. The landscape will hold us gently as we travel, as it has always held those who move through it with patience, and the story will unfold in its own time, the way all old things unfold, slowly and with the quiet authority of something that has lasted long enough to know it need not rush. The lamplight of that ancient world flickers softly at the edge of the evening, and the hills are very still. And there is time to rest now before we find our way, in the next chapter, to the village itself, and to the house, and to the family gathered there in the ordinary warmth of an Iron Age evening. The town of Bethlehem sits on a long ridge of limestone, a spine of pale rock running roughly north and south through the hill country of Judah. And even now, even after all the centuries that have passed over it like slow water over stone, the land around it keeps something of the character it wore in the early Iron Age, when the account of David's family first begins to take shape in the ancient sources. The terraces step down the hillsides in gentle stages, built up over generations by farmers who understood that the thin soil of these hills would slide away in the winter rains unless it was held, carefully, patiently, by walls of stacked limestone that they laid by hand. Olive trees grow from that soil with a kind of slow, almost indifferent persistence, their roots finding cracks in the rock, their gray-green leaves turning silver in the afternoon light. And in the Iron Age, around the 11th century before the Common Era, groves very much like these would have been tended by families very much like the one the tradition calls the House of Jesse. Jesse, according to the genealogy that has come down through the text of Samuel and repeated again in Chronicles, was the son of Obed and the grandson of Boaz, names that belong also to the older narrative of Ruth, a story set in these same Bethlehem fields during the barley harvest, among people who moved between the seasons and the soil with an ease that speaks of long familiarity. Whether the precise details of that lineage are recoverable history or the careful arrangement of later tradition is something historians continue to debate, gently and with much nuance, but what is not in doubt is that the setting is real and old and deeply rooted in the landscape of Judah. Bethlehem in this period was not a large place. Archaeology suggests that the hill country settlements of Iron Age Judah were modest in scale, villages rather than cities, clusters of stone-built houses arranged around shared courtyards where families worked, stored grain, sheltered animals in the colder months, and lived the close, overlapping lives of people who depended on one another through every season. Jesse, the account tells us, had 8 sons, and this alone gives a sense of the texture of a household in that world. For sons meant hands for the fields, boys who would grow into men who could tend the flocks and bring in the harvest and defend the family's interests in whatever disputes arose with neighboring clans over water rights or grazing land. The eldest sons in such a family would have carried weight and expectation from the time they were old enough to understand what those things meant. The tradition names them Eliab, who was the firstborn, tall and striking in appearance according to the account, then Abinadab, then Shammah, and others whose names appear in various forms across the different versions of the text. And at the end of all of them, the youngest, the one who tends the sheep while his brothers stand before Samuel, the one who is almost overlooked, the one whose name is David. Being the youngest son in a household of 8 boys in the ancient Near East carried with it a particular kind of invisibility. The customs of the time and place gave priority to the elder sons in matters of inheritance and standing, and the youngest would have grown up understanding, in that wordless way that children understand the structures of their world before they can articulate them, that he occupied the lowest rung of a long ladder. He would have been given the tasks that fell to the smallest and least significant, watching the sheep on the hillsides, while his older brothers did the work that was considered more worthy of a grown man's attention. And yet, the tradition consistently presents this position not as a limitation, but as a kind of preparation, a slow and solitary education conducted by the hills themselves. The daily life of a shepherd in the Iron Age hill country of Judah was shaped almost entirely by the land and the animals, and the weather, in that order. The flocks that families like Jesse's would have kept were composed mostly of sheep and goats, animals well suited to the rocky, scrubby terrain, able to find nourishment in places where cattle could not. A shepherd's task was to move these animals along the routes that led to water and to pasture, to know where the seasonal springs ran and where the grass grew thickest after rain, to keep the flock together against the many dangers of the open country, which in that period included predators, wolves, and lions being mentioned in the ancient sources as real threats in the wilder margins of the landscape. as well as the ever-present risk of an animal straying into difficult ground and injuring itself. The tools of that work were simple and effective, and had been used in similar forms for thousands of years before David's time. A wooden staff for walking and guiding the animals, a sling woven from plant fiber or leather for driving away threats at a distance, a tool that skilled shepherds could use with remarkable accuracy, sending a smooth stone from a stream bed in a fast, low arc toward a target many paces away. The sling was not a toy or a weapon of last resort. It was a practical instrument of the shepherd's trade, carried as naturally as the staff, kept ready in the hand or at the belt, and its use would have been learned young and practiced often. The tradition of David's later encounter with the Philistine champion draws on exactly this detail, and while historians discuss how much of that account is literal history, and how much has been shaped by narrative tradition, the picture of a young shepherd who could use a sling with confidence is entirely plausible for the time and place. Out on the hillsides, alone or nearly so for long stretches of the day, and sometimes through the mild nights of the dry season, when the flock was kept in the open, a shepherd would have had time and quantities that few other lives provided. Time to watch the light change on the limestone ridges as the sun moved across the sky. Time to listen to the particular silence of the Judean highlands, which is not truly a silence at all, but a layered texture of wind through dry grass, the bells of distant goats, the occasional cry of a hawk circling over the valley below. Time to think and to sing, and perhaps to compose the kind of short, rhythmic phrases that in that oral culture would have been the beginning of poetry, passed from the mind to the lips and back again until the words settled into a shape that could be remembered and repeated. The tradition, of course, associates David with music and with the composition of the Psalms, and while the precise authorship of those ancient hymns is a matter of considerable scholarly discussion, with many historians believing the collection to be the work of many hands across many centuries, the association itself is old and deeply embedded in the way the ancient sources portray him. A shepherd boy with a lyre, sitting on a hillside above Bethlehem, singing to himself and to his animals and to the wide, pale sky. This image may or may not be a literal memory, but it belongs to the landscape in a way that feels entirely natural. For music in the ancient Near East was woven into daily life as thoroughly as bread and water, present at the threshold of almost every human occasion. Jesse's household, like all the households of Iron Age Judah, would have moved through the year in close rhythm with the agricultural calendar. The autumn rains brought relief after the long dry summer and softened the soil for plowing. Winter was the season of uncertainty, when the rains either came in enough abundance to promise a good harvest or withheld themselves, bringing anxiety and sometimes famine. Spring was the barley harvest, followed by wheat, and the summer months brought the olive harvest and the pressing of oil, one of the principal commodities of this region, traded down into the coastal lowlands and across the wider ancient world. The family's life was governed by these rhythms, by the needs of the animals in the fields, by the slow conversation between human effort and the land's own willingness to yield. And somewhere in that life, perhaps sitting in the courtyard in the early evening as the cooking fire was lit and the smell of wood smoke drifted across the terrace, or perhaps out on the hillside as the last light left the ridge and the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky above Bethlehem, was the youngest son of Jesse, still unremarkable, still invisible, still tending his father's flocks in the way that youngest sons did. The fire in the courtyard would have burned low as the evening settled, and the family would have drawn together against the cool of the night. And David, if the tradition holds any thread of truth, would have been there among them, watching the flames, listening to the voices of his brothers, not yet knowing that anything at all was about to change. The hills are quiet before the sun has fully cleared the ridge. In that particular hour when the darkness has not quite finished leaving and the light has not quite finished arriving, the limestone slopes of the Judean highlands exist in a kind of suspended stillness. The grasses holding the last of the night's coolness, the rocky outcroppings still faintly gray, the air carrying nothing yet but the smell of earth, and the distant soft complaint of waking animals. It is into this hour, the tradition tells us, that we might place the young David, a boy moving out across a familiar hillside, his flock spreading gradually before him, each sheep finding its own quiet rhythm as the morning slowly opened around them all. The account of David's early years comes to us racked in the language of ancient poetry and sacred memory, and the historians who study this period remind us that we cannot always be certain where biography ends and symbol begins. What the tradition preserves with remarkable consistency is this image: the youngest son of Jesse, not yet needed in the councils of men, sent out to tend the flocks in the open country around Bethlehem. And while scholars debate the precise details, the landscape itself remains: the same terraced hillsides, the same rocky paths between grazing grounds, the same quality of silence that has always existed in those hills when the settlements have quieted and only the animals and their keeper remain. It is said that a shepherd's life in the Iron Age hill country was, above all else, a life of sustained attention. There was no single dramatic task to accomplish, no clear beginning and ending to the work. There was instead the long, unbroken practice of watching the sky for changes in the weather, watching the flock for signs of illness or distress, watching the slopes for any movement that might signal the presence of predators moving in from the thickets and the deeper wilderness that lay beyond the cultivated margins. A boy who spent enough seasons in this work would have learned, almost without knowing it was a lesson, to read the world through its subtleties: the color of a cloud, the direction of a breeze across the dry grass, the way a single animal's posture could tell you something was wrong before you had quite consciously understood what you had seen. The tradition, as it has come down through the texts, speaks specifically of this quality in David, a kind of alert, unhurried awareness that the pastoral years had formed in him. The account describes encounters with lions and with bears, with the young shepherd defending his flock against predators in the rough country, and while the historical nature of these specific encounters cannot be confirmed with certainty, they speak to something true about the demands of that life and that landscape. The wilderness to the east of Bethlehem fell away quickly into the stark ravines and hidden valleys that would one day become David's own refuge, and in those border country hills between the settled fields and the open desert, wild animals were a real and present part of the shepherd's world. To be responsible for a flock in such terrain required both physical courage and a particular calmness, the kind that does not freeze in sudden danger, but responds with the steady, practiced skill of someone who has learned to trust their own hands. It would have been long hours, too, that required nothing of the hands at all. Hours when the flock had settled into its grazing, and the hillside held nothing more urgent than the sound of wind moving through the scrub and the occasional distant call of a bird somewhere above the limestone ridgeline. The tradition has always associated David with music, and the story goes that these solitary hours on the hills were the hours in which that music found its early shape. A stringed instrument small enough to carry, producing sounds that rose into the open air and were absorbed by the indifferent, generous landscape around him. Whether we understand these accounts literally or as the natural poetic memory of a culture that remembered its greatest king through the lens of its most beloved musical tradition, there is something in the image that feels quietly true. The hills of the Judean highlands have a particular quality of resonance. Sound carries strangely in them, and in their open spaces, music would have felt less like performance and more like a kind of conversation with the silence itself. To grow up tending animals in such a landscape was also to learn something of patience in its deepest form, not the passive patience of waiting for something to happen, but the active patience of being fully present in time that seemed to any outside eye to contain very little. A shepherd could not hurry the morning into afternoon. He could not encourage the grass to grow faster or the water sources to fill more quickly after the dry season. He moved at the pace the landscape set, and the landscape in those ancient hills set a pace that had not changed significantly in centuries, in millennia. The Iron Age boy who walked those routes was walking paths that pastoralists had followed long before him and would follow long after, and there is something in that continuity, felt perhaps unconsciously, absorbed through the feet and the eyes and the slow rhythm of the working days, that may have given him a quality of groundedness, a rootedness in something older and larger than the immediate concerns of any single life. The tradition also preserves in various ways the suggestion that these years of solitude were years in which something interior was quietly developing, a capacity for reflection, for feeling, for the kind of inward attentiveness that the poetry attributed to David so vividly displays. The Psalms, whatever their complex history of composition and editing, contain a sensibility shaped by open landscape. They speak of hills and valleys, of shadows and still waters, of a watchfulness that is both human and something more than human. Whether David composed them or whether later poets wrote in his voice and his tradition, those images had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere that the tradition consistently points to is these hills, this shepherd's life, this long and quiet education in the language of the natural world. The sun, by mid-morning, would have climbed well above the eastern ridge, and the limestone would have begun to hold the warmth of it, giving back in the middle hours of the day a dry, radiant heat that made the shadows of the fig trees and the rock faces into destinations of genuine relief. The flock would have slowed, sought out the shaded places, and the boy would have settled somewhere among the rocks or beneath a tree, perhaps eating the simple food that had been pressed into his hands before he left the house: bread, dried figs, a skin of water. And the world around him would have existed in a deep, almost absolute midday quiet, broken only by the sounds of the animals themselves, and far below and out of sight, whatever life continued in the settlement without him. It is easy, from the distance of several thousand years, to romanticize these scenes, to make of them something more picturesque than they perhaps were. The reality of a shepherd's life in the Iron Age Levant included cold, real cold, in the winter months when the highland winds came from the north, and the rains came in horizontal gray sheets across the hillsides. It included illness among the animals, and the grief of losing a member of the flock to some hidden ravine or sudden sickness. It included the loneliness that even the most solitary of temperaments must occasionally have felt, the longing for the warmth of the household, the voices of the family, the firelight in the room. These too were part of the education, the learning, through small and repeated experience, that difficulty passes, that the cold morning gives way to the warm afternoon, that the difficult season does not last forever, that tending carefully to what is in front of you is the only work that can actually be done. And so the days would have accumulated, season upon season, and the boy on the hillside would have grown, not yet knowing, the tradition suggests, that any of this would matter beyond the immediate circuit of the hills and the household, not yet knowing that anything larger was approaching. The flock moved, the grasses bent in the evening wind, the limestone ridges held the last of the day's color as the sun descended toward the western horizon, and the air cooled once more toward the quality it had held in that first quiet hour of morning. Somewhere below, in the settlement, the cooking fires would have been lit by now, their smoke rising in thin columns against the dimming sky, a signal, a small warmth seen from the hillside, that it was time to begin gathering the flock and turning back toward home. And the world was still, for now, entirely ordinary. Yet there were older things beginning to stir in the life of that hill country, things that moved not in a single boy's awareness, but in the larger, slower currents of politics and power and the changing shape of the land's history. And those currents, in their own time, would find their way even to the quiet hillside above Bethlehem. The wind moves differently along the coastal plain. Up in the hill country where the shepherds kept their flocks, the air came in gusts and eddies, shaped by the contours of limestone ridges and the narrow wadis that ran between them, carrying the smell of wild thyme and dry earth and the faint mineral sharpness of ancient rock. But down where the land flattened and opened toward the great sea in the west, the wind arrived in long, steady streams, unbroken and purposeful, bending the grasses in wide, slow waves and carrying salt on its tongue. It was a different world down there, a world of wider skies and broader ambitions, and it was from that world that the pressures came, the pressures that would, in time, reach all the way up into the quiet hills and pull a young shepherd boy out of his ordinary life and into something far larger than he had ever imagined. To understand the world into which David was growing, it helps to sit for a moment with the shape of the land itself and with the peoples who moved across it. The southern Levant in the early Iron Age, which historians place roughly in the centuries around 1,000 years before the Common Era, was not a land at peace. It was a land in motion, a crossroads territory where older Bronze Age powers had collapsed and newer forces were still finding their footing, still pressing against one another to determine who would hold the valleys, who would command the roads, who would extract the resources and exact the tribute, and build the walls that said, in the language of stone, "We are here and we intend to remain." Along the coastal plain and the lower foothills known as the Shephelah, the people whom the ancient texts call the Philistines had established themselves in a cluster of 5 major city-states: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Archaeologists have studied these cities carefully, and what has emerged from the soil is a picture of a sophisticated, urban, well-organized culture, a people who built large, well-planned settlements, who worked metal with notable skill, and who maintained a military capacity that the scattered, largely pastoral communities of the hill country found enormously difficult to resist. It is generally thought that the Philistines were among the peoples who arrived in the Levant from the Aegean world, or from the broader eastern Mediterranean, in the unsettled centuries that followed the collapse of the great Bronze Age palace cultures, though historians continue to debate the precise details of their origins. What is less disputed is the material record. Their pottery, their architecture, their weaponry, all speak of a culture with strong roots elsewhere, transplanted and adapted, and growing now with considerable confidence along the warm, fertile margins of the sea. This was a source of sustained, grinding anxiety. The hill country peoples, among them those who had come to be known in the tradition as Israel, were not without resources or resilience, but they were organized differently, more loosely, around clans and family groups and the rhythms of agriculture and herding, rather than around the centralizing logic of urban kingship. They held the high ground, which provided a certain natural defense, but the Philistines controlled the lower corridors through which trade moved and armies traveled, and they held, the ancient accounts suggest, a considerable advantage in iron technology that made their weapons and their agricultural tools superior to what the Highlanders could readily produce. The account in the first book of Samuel describes a situation in which the Israelites had to go down to Philistine smiths, even to sharpen their plowshares and their axes, a detail that historians find broadly plausible as a reflection of real technological and economic pressure, even if the picture may be somewhat simplified. It was into this fraught landscape that the figure of Saul emerged. The tradition is quite specific about how this happened, and the account is one of the more richly textured in the entire narrative. According to the telling that has come down to us, the elders of the Israelite communities came to the prophet Samuel, himself a towering figure in the tradition, a man who served as judge and spiritual authority in an era before kings, and they asked him for a king. They wanted, the account says, to be like the other nations, to have a central figure who could lead them into battle, who could hold them together against the relentless pressure from the west. Samuel, the tradition tells us, was troubled by this request, seeing in it a kind of rejection of the older ways, a turning toward human power at the expense of something more ancient and less visible. But the request was granted, and the man chosen was Saul, son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin, described as standing head and shoulders above his contemporaries, a striking physical presence from a small but strategically positioned tribe in the hill country. What Saul inherited was not by any measure an easy throne. Historians who work on this period are careful to note that the nature of Saul's kingdom, its size, its administrative complexity, its territorial extent, remains genuinely uncertain, and that the picture painted in the biblical text almost certainly reflects later elaboration and idealization. What does seem clear is that the early Israelite monarchy, whatever its precise character, was born under pressure. Saul's reign was defined from its earliest moments by the need to respond to external threats, and the most persistent of those threats came from the Philistines in the west. There were also pressures from other directions, from the Ammonites to the east, from the Amalekites to the south, and the tradition records a series of military encounters that occupied much of Saul's energy and shaped the character of his reign. What the tradition also records, and what gives the story of Saul its particular melancholy texture, is the slow unraveling of his relationship with Samuel, and through Samuel, with the religious authority that had legitimized his kingship in the first place. There are accounts of Saul acting in ways that transgressed the boundaries of his role as king, performing ritual functions that were not his to perform, failing to carry out instructions to the letter, making decisions in the heat of military necessity that the tradition judges harshly. Whether these accounts preserve the memory of actual events, or whether they represent later theological interpretation layered over a simpler historical reality, is something historians debate with care and without reaching firm conclusions. What they give us, as readers and listeners across all these centuries, is a portrait of a man who was genuinely capable and genuinely troubled, a figure of real pathos, burdened by the expectations of a role that was itself new and uncertain, susceptible perhaps to the anxieties that came with holding a kingdom together by force of personality when the institutional structures to support that kingdom were still so fragile. The court that Saul established was modest by the standards of the great kingdoms of the ancient Near East. There was no grand palace, no elaborate bureaucracy, no extensive trading networks of the kind that Egypt had maintained for centuries, or that the later Phoenician cities would develop along the northern coast. Saul's seat at Gibeah, a site that has been partially excavated by archaeologists, appears to have been a relatively simple fortified structure. A tower house, perhaps, rather than a palace in any elaborate sense. The people around him were warriors and kinsmen, bound by loyalty and shared danger, rather than by the more formal ties of an established court culture. It was a world that was in the process of becoming something, a monarchy in its earliest, most uncertain phase, feeling its way toward institutions that did not yet exist. And yet it was into this world that the young David of Bethlehem would soon be drawn. Not yet, not in this chapter of the story, not on this particular evening, for now he was still on the hillside, still learning the patience of the shepherd's watch, still listening to the wind move through the valleys below his father's land. But the world that Saul was struggling to hold together was already shaping the conditions that would bring David to notice. The Philistine pressure along the western margins, the military needs of a kingdom without enough trained soldiers or strong enough commanders, the restlessness of a king whose confidence in himself and in his standing with the old religious authorities was already beginning to erode. All of these things were working slowly, like water finding its way through limestone, carving the channel through which a young man from Bethlehem would eventually flow. The night settles gently over the Judean hills, and somewhere across the ridgelines to the west, the last of the day's wind off the sea fades into stillness. The plain grows quiet. The city-states along the coast settle into their own evening routines, their hearth fires burning in the darkness, their iron tools laid aside until morning. And in the hill country, among the terraced fields and the scattered flocks, the ordinary world continues, not yet touched by history, not yet pulled into the current of what is coming. But the current is already running, deep beneath the surface of things, moving in its patient and unhurried way toward the moment when everything will change. The barley was already in when Samuel came to Bethlehem. That is how one imagines it, at least, the season of first harvest, when the Judean hillsides wore their brief gold before the long, dry summer settled in, and the land turned the color of pale stone and bleached grass. It was a time of threshing and gathering, of communal work in the open air, of dust rising from the flat rocks where grain was beaten loose from its stalks, and of that particular smell, dry and sweet and ancient, that belongs to harvested fields in the southern highlands. Into this ordinary, industrious, sun-warmed world, the account tells us, came one of the most consequential visitors in the long memory of Israel. Samuel, the judge and prophet, the man who had anointed Saul, and who now, according to the tradition, carried a new and secret purpose in his heart, and a horn of oil among his traveling things. The story that has come down to us, preserved in the first book of Samuel, is spare in the way that the oldest narratives often are. It offers us just enough detail to see the shape of the event, and leaves the texture of it to the imagination. Samuel arrives in Bethlehem, and the account tells us that the elders of the town came out to meet him with something like anxiety, asking whether his coming brought peace. This small detail is worth resting with for a moment, because it tells us something true about that world. A prophet of Samuel's standing did not travel lightly or without significance. His presence meant something was happening, or about to happen. The elders would have known his name, known his authority, known the weight he carried in the life of the confederacy of tribes. And so they came to him at the edge of town, in that careful, watchful way of people who understand that important visitors change things, and they asked, in effect, whether they had cause for alarm. Samuel reassured them, the account says, and called for a sacrifice, a communal gathering that would provide both the occasion and the cover for what he had actually come to do. There is something quietly human about this detail too, that even the grand movements of history sometimes need to arrange themselves around ordinary ritual, around the shared meal and the smoke of offerings, around the kind of gathering that towns in that landscape held regularly and without fuss. The sacrifice gave everyone a reason to be present. It gave Samuel a reason to be there, and it meant that what he was truly about to do could happen within the folds of something unremarkable. Jesse and his sons were invited, and they came. The tradition describes what followed in a way that has the quality of a dream or a test. Samuel looked at the sons of Jesse one by one, beginning with the eldest, and the account says that when he saw the first, a man called Eliab, tall and striking by the description, Samuel thought he was looking at the one he had come to find. But according to the story, he was told inwardly that this was not so, and the reason given has passed into the long memory of the tradition like a quiet thread, that the measure of a person is not what is visible from the outside, not height or bearing or the impression a figure makes against the light. The account uses the language of the heart, that what matters is something interior, something not available to ordinary sight. And so Eliab was passed over, and then Abinadab, and then Shammah. 7 sons in all came before Samuel, and one by one, according to the story, each was set aside. 7 is a number that carries its own weight in the literature of the ancient Near East. It is the number of completeness, of a full cycle, and so there is something almost deliberate in the rhythm of this telling. 7 sons, 7 refusals, and then the question that breaks the pattern. Samuel asked Jesse whether these were all his children, and Jesse said that the youngest was not present. He was out with the sheep. It is a detail so simple that it almost disappears, and yet it is worth holding gently for a moment, because it tells us where David was on the day his life changed entirely. He was not at the gathering. He had not been invited, or perhaps had not been thought of. The youngest, the one still needed for the daily work, the one whose place in the family was not yet significant enough to require his presence at something that mattered. He was on the hillside, or in the valley below the town, or somewhere among the terraces and rocky paths with the animals in his care, entirely unaware that a visitor had come, that his brothers were being examined one by one, that something was being decided. Samuel asked for him to be sent for. The account gives us a brief description of David's appearance when he arrived. Ruddy, it says, and with beautiful eyes, and the tradition has added the word goodly or pleasant to look upon, though historians note that the Hebrew here is somewhat ambiguous and has been translated in different ways across the centuries. What is clear is that something about the young man, whatever he looked like after a day with the flocks, was sufficient for the moment. According to the story, Samuel was told that this was the one, and so he anointed him, poured oil from the horn he carried over David's head, right there in the middle of the gathering, with his brothers and father present. One pauses over this scene because of how strange it must have seemed from any ordinary human perspective. Samuel was not anointing a crown prince. He was not anointing someone at a royal court, or a man with armies or alliances, or the visible trappings of political power. He was anointing a shepherd boy in a small highland town that was not a capital, not a center of anything, not on any major route of trade or military significance. The oil ran down over the head of someone who would go back to the sheep afterward, who would return to his family's house and his daily work and the quiet rhythm of the hills. Whatever had happened in that room or that courtyard was entirely invisible to the wider world. No Philistine general knew about it. No rival king took note. Even within the family of Jesse, Historians speculate about how much any of them understood about what had just occurred. The account itself acknowledges the secrecy by not making much of the aftermath. David does not become a king the next day, or the next year, or for a long time after. The tradition holds that what happened at Bethlehem was a kind of invisible hinge, a moment that turned the future without anyone outside the room knowing it. That quality of the hidden, of the important thing happening quietly and out of sight, is one of the recurring textures of this narrative. The southern highlands were full of such small, unremarked events. The daily decisions of farmers and shepherds, the slow work of seasons, the quiet endurance of ordinary people whose names were not written down. Into that texture, the tradition inserts this one extraordinary secret. Samuel completed what he had come to do and then left. The account says he went to Ramah, his own city, and the narrative moves on quickly. There is no fanfare, no announcement, no moment of transformation that anyone could have pointed to later and said, "There, that was the day everything changed." David went back to his life. Jesse went back to his. The barley harvest continued in its ordinary way, the threshing floors filled with their ancient dust. The mornings came and went over the Judean hills with their usual indifference to human hopes and human stories. It is said that the weight of that anointing was carried quietly for years, through all the events that were to follow, through the strange turns of fortune and danger and exile and grief that lay ahead. The oil that was poured on David's head in Bethlehem dried and was forgotten in the way of small daily events. And yet, according to the tradition, it was not forgotten in any deeper sense. It remained as a kind of seed, buried in the ordinary soil of a shepherd's life, waiting for the long, slow work of time. And now, if you are comfortable and your breathing has begun to slow, let that image rest in your mind for a moment. The small gathering in Bethlehem, the smell of oil and dry air, and the lingering smoke of the sacrificial fire. The youngest son still carrying the scent of the hillside on his clothes. Something had been placed in the world quietly that day, though the world did not know it yet. And soon enough, the story will carry us toward the place where that hidden thing began, very gradually to move, toward a great king's household, toward music played in lamplight, toward the complicated warmth and sadness of a royal court, where a young man from the hills was about to become something he had never imagined he would be. The lamps were being lit in Gibeah. One by one, small flames caught and steadied in the evening air, sending thin threads of smoke upward through the doorways of the settlement, and the smell of oil and warm clay drifted out across the hillside, where the last of the day's light was softening into something pale and indistinct along the western ridge. This was the seat of Saul's court, a place called Gibeah of Saul in the accounts that have come down to us. And though it was not a city in any grand sense, not yet, not in the way that the great walled cities of the coastal plains were cities, it was nonetheless a place of consequence, a hilltop settlement in the territory of Benjamin, where the business of a young and uncertain kingdom was slowly, haltingly being conducted. The archaeology of this region, the low hills of Benjamin, lying just north of the older tribal highlands of Judah, suggests a landscape of modest but well-established villages in the Iron Age, clustered among terraced slopes, connected by paths worn smooth by generations of feet and hooves. Gibeah itself has been associated by some scholars with a site called Tel El-Ful, a modest mound rising above the surrounding terrain, where excavations in earlier centuries uncovered remains consistent with an Iron Age stronghold of some kind, though historians continue to debate the precise identification and the nature of whatever structures may have stood there. Whatever the exact shape of Saul's court, it is safe to say it would have looked nothing like the marble halls of Egypt or the cedar-paneled palaces of the great Phoenician cities to the north. It would have been a place of mud brick and rough stone, of beaten earth floors and woven curtains, of fires built for warmth and cooking, of men carrying weapons and speaking in lowered voices about enemies and alliances and the uncertain favor of the divine. It was into this world, according to the tradition, that a young man from Bethlehem first arrived, carrying his lyre. The account tells us that Saul had fallen into deep and recurring distress, a darkness of spirit that settled over him like a change in weather, and that his servants, seeking some remedy, suggested that music might soothe what troubled him. It is one of the most quietly human details in the whole of the narrative. A king beset by something interior and unnamed, and the practical, gentle suggestion from those around him that a skilled musician might ease the weight of it. The ancient world understood very well the power of music to shift the mood of a room, to slow the breath, to carry the mind somewhere softer. And so word was sent out, and the name that came back, the story goes, was the name of a young man in Bethlehem, known already for his skill with the lyre, and described in the account in terms that suggest both physical presence and a kind of inner brightness, though the precise language of such descriptions must always be read with an awareness that ancient biographical writing worked in conventions and ideals as much as in plain reportage. David came to Gibeah, and the lamps received him. The relationship that developed between the young musician and the troubled king is one of the more psychologically layered elements of the whole David tradition, and it repays slow and thoughtful consideration. The account describes Saul as loving David greatly, finding real comfort in the young man's presence, and appointing him not only as his personal musician, but also as his armor-bearer. This latter role is worth pausing over, because it was not a minor appointment. An armor-bearer in the military culture of the ancient Near East was a position of genuine trust and intimacy. A man who stood close to a warrior or commander in the most dangerous moments, who carried the weapons and the shield, who was expected to be capable, alert, and absolutely loyal. To be named as armor-bearer was to enter the innermost circle of a leader's personal retinue, and it tells us something about the impression David made, quickly apparently, on those around him. And so David moved through the rooms of Saul's household, carrying his lyre in the evenings and his duties in the days, learning the rhythms of a court that was itself still learning what a court should be. There would have been other men in that household, commanders and counselors, priests and servants, the members of Saul's own family, moving through the low-lit corridors of the settlement. We hear in the account of Jonathan, Saul's eldest son, whose bond with David became one of the most celebrated friendships in the whole of the textual tradition, described in language of such warmth and depth that it has been contemplated and written about across many centuries and many cultures. The account tells that Jonathan's soul was knit to David's soul, and that Jonathan loved him as he loved himself. And whatever the precise nature of that bond in its ancient context, it is clear that the tradition preserves a memory of something genuine and sustaining, a friendship forged in the peculiar heat of a royal court where loyalty and danger were always near one another. There were also, in that household, Saul's daughters, Merab and Michal, and the account will later tell of Michal's own attachment to David, a thread of the story that winds forward into more complicated territory. For now, in these early days, it is enough to imagine the young man from the Bethlehem hills finding his footing among people whose lives were shaped by power and proximity to power, learning the speech and customs of a court, sleeping perhaps in rooms that still smelled of the mud brick from which they had been made, hearing in the evenings the distant sounds of animals settling down across the hillside, sounds not so unlike the ones he had grown up listening to on the slopes above Bethlehem. The lyre would have been brought out in the hours when Saul's darkness descended. We can try gently to imagine that scene, the king seated, the room quieter than usual, the other attendants drawing back slightly as the young musician settled himself and began to play. The music of the ancient Levant is lost to us in any direct sense. We cannot know what those melodies sounded like, what tunings or modes the lyres of the Iron Age employed. Those scholars have attempted to reconstruct something of the musical world of the ancient Near East through the study of instruments recovered from archaeological sites, through textual references and iconographic evidence from across the region. What we can say is that music occupied a serious and honored place in the life of the ancient Near East, that it was connected to ritual, to community, to the regulation of powerful emotions, and that a skilled musician would have been genuinely valued, not as mere entertainment, but as someone who understood something about the inner life of human experience and how to move through it. The account tells us that when David played, the evil spirit would depart from Saul, and Saul would find relief. There is something in this detail, whatever one makes of its theological dimensions, that resonates with a very old and very human understanding of what music can do. Not cure, perhaps, but ease. Not solve, but soften. Not drive out darkness entirely, but hold a lamp against it long enough for the spirit to breathe. And yet the tradition also knows that this peace was not permanent, and that the household of Saul was not a simple place of safety for the young man from Bethlehem. The very qualities that drew people toward David, the brightness that the account describes, the skill, and the ease with which he moved among others, would in time become sources of something more complicated in the king's heart. Historians and readers have long noted that the narrative of David's time in Saul's court contains within it the seeds of a tension that would slowly, over the chapters that follow, transform into something far more difficult. But that unfolding belongs to later nights, later tellings. For now, in these early days of lamplight and music, the young man was simply there, present in the court, present in the king's household, learning the feel of a world larger than the hillsides of Bethlehem, and playing his lyre in the evenings, while the small flames burned steadily in the rooms of Gibeah, and the hills of Benjamin lay quiet and dark outside. Let that image rest with you for a moment. The music, the firelight, the steady breathing of a court settling toward night, as you two settle now, letting the sound of it all grow gentler and more distant, like a melody carried away on a wind that moves across the hills and is gone, leaving only stillness behind. The wadi runs quiet in the dry season, its bed of pale, smooth stones catching whatever light filters down between the chalk hills on either side. And it is here, in this shallow valley called Elah, that one of the most enduring stories in all of human memory is said to have taken place. The Shephelah, that word means simply the lowlands, the foothills, the gentle sloping country between the high Judean ridge and the flat coastal plain to the west, is a world apart from the stony pastures where we have spent our earlier evenings. Here the land softens. The terraced hills give way to broader valleys, to terebinth trees casting wide pools of shadow, to the kind of open ground that armies have always sought when they wish to meet one another in the old formal way of ancient warfare. And it is across this softer, more open country that the Philistines and the people of Israel gazed at one another across generations, each side watching the other's fires at night, each side listening for the sounds that might carry on the evening wind. Archaeology has been patient in the Shephelah. Excavations at sites like Tel Azekah and Tel Soko, the very places named in the older texts as landmarks flanking the Valley of Elah, have turned up layers of occupation reaching back well beyond the Iron Age, confirming that this corridor of land was indeed a zone of contact and contest between the cultures of the coast and the cultures of the hills. The Philistines were themselves a remarkable people, descended according to the broader historical picture from migrants connected to the movement of sea peoples across the eastern Mediterranean sometime in the 12th century before the Common Era, settling into 5 great cities along the coast, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and bringing with them technologies and traditions that set them somewhat apart from their neighbors. They worked iron with a skill that gave them a military advantage for a considerable period. They made distinctive painted pottery. They buried their dead in ways that echoed more distantly Mediterranean practices. And they pressed steadily eastward, into the foothills, century by century. The Israelites of the hill country, for their part, were organized in a looser, more tribal fashion during this early Iron Age period, and historians have long noted that the transition to kingship described in the older texts, the choosing of Saul, the formation of a more centralized fighting force, seems to correspond in broad outline with precisely the kind of pressure that archaeological evidence suggests the Philistines were exerting on the highlands during this era. The political world was real and pressing. The threat was not imaginary, and it is into this very real geopolitical tension that the tradition places young David, still barely known beyond his father's household in Bethlehem, carrying food to his older brothers who stand in the Israelite lines overlooking the valley. The account tells of a champion from the Philistine camp, a warrior of extraordinary size, whose name comes down to us as Goliath, described as coming from Gath, one of those 5 great coastal cities. The text as it has been preserved describes him in striking physical terms. His height given in the older manuscripts is 4 cubits and a span, which some scholars estimate at somewhere near 2.5 meters, though other manuscript traditions offer different numbers, and historians debate precisely how to read the ancient measurements. He is described as wearing a coat of scale armor, carrying a spear with a shaft compared to a weaver's beam, accompanied by a shield-bearer who walked before him. The challenge he is said to have issued is a classical one, known from other ancient Near Eastern sources as well. Single combat between champions, the outcome to settle the matter for both armies, sparing the wider bloodshed of a full engagement. What is interesting to the historically minded reader is that this practice, the resolution of conflict through representative combat, does appear in documents from the broader ancient world and is not simply a fanciful invention. It fits the period, it fits the place. Whether the specific encounter unfolded precisely as the story has come down to us across 3,000 years of transmission, copying, and translation is something no one can say with certainty, and it is worth holding the account gently, with open hands, as we listen to it. The story goes that none among the Israelite warriors would accept the challenge. The account describes a paralysis of fear in the camp, a stillness born of dread, lasting 40 days by the traditional reckoning. 40 days in which the valley held its breath, in which the armies faced each other across that pale riverbed of smooth stones, and nothing moved. And then David arrives, young, still smelling of the hills and the flocks, sent by his father Jesse with provisions for his brothers. Knowing nothing of battlefields in any formal sense, he hears the challenge. He does not understand the fear, and according to the tradition, he steps forward. What the text emphasizes, with a kind of quiet insistence, is not brute strength, but a particular confidence rooted in his experience of the wilderness, an experience we have already traced across our earlier evenings together. He describes to Saul, the account tells us, how he has killed lions and bears in defense of his father's flock, and how this encounter seems to him of the same nature, a threat to be met with the same steady hands. He refuses the king's armor, famously, because he has not tested it, because it is not his, because it belongs to a different kind of fighting than the one he knows. He goes to the stream, to the wadi floor, to those pale rounded stones we can picture lying in the dry bed of the Elah Valley, and he chooses 5 smooth ones. The sling was not a toy in the ancient world. It was a weapon of real military significance, used by specialized units and armies across the Near East and the Mediterranean. A skilled slinger could achieve considerable accuracy and deliver a stone with enough force to cause serious injury at a distance that kept him well beyond the reach of a sword or a spear. The Benjaminites, the text elsewhere notes, were particularly renowned for left-handed slingers of exceptional skill. The weapon David chooses is not an improvised last resort, but the tool of his trade, the instrument he has trained with since boyhood, on the open hillsides above Bethlehem, the thing his hands know best in all the world. The encounter itself, the account describes in very few words, which gives it a kind of spare, almost windswept quality, a single stone loosed from the sling, and then the great silence of something ending. The tradition says the stone struck Goliath in the forehead, and that he fell, and that the battle that followed was swift and decisive, the Philistines retreating westward toward their own cities, while the Israelite forces pursued them down the valley and out toward the coastal plain. The Valley of Elah, in the story as it has come down to us, becomes the pivot point of a larger change, the moment when a shepherd boy from Bethlehem enters, suddenly and irreversibly, the notice of a king. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the retelling, to notice how the landscape itself seems almost to participate in the story. You can walk it today. The terebinth trees still cast their shade along the hillsides. The wadi still holds its stones, pale and smooth, washed down across centuries of winter rains from the hills above. Archaeologists have confirmed the presence of both Israelite and Philistine material culture in the settlements flanking this valley during the Iron Age, which means that real people, on real mornings, once looked out across this ground with the particular alertness of those who know that conflict lives close by. Whatever the precise shape of events in the valley that day, the geography is not invented, the tension was not imaginary, and the world in which the story lives is a world made of actual stone, and actual wind, and actual fire burning in camp after camp, along the hillsides in the long Iron Age evenings. And it is those evenings we might rest in now, as we let the story settle into its proper place, not urgent, not anxious, but simply present, the way all old stories eventually become present when we stop rushing through them. The boy with the sling would go on, as the tradition tells it, to enter the court of the king whose throne he would one day inherit, stepping out of the open air of the pastures into something altogether more complicated and enclosed. But that world, the world of lamplight and palace shadow, the world of politics and music and the king's troubled household, belongs to our next evening together. For now the valley holds its quiet. The stones lie in the dry riverbed, as they have always lain, and somewhere on the hills above, a fire burns small and steady against the darkening sky. The light goes first from the highest places. It happens slowly, almost without announcement. The limestone ridges of the Judean hills holding the last warmth of the sun, long after the valleys below have filled with a soft, pooling shadow, the color of the stone shifting from white to cream to the faintest amber, as though the rock itself were breathing out the heat it has gathered through the long hours of the day. Then that warmth drains too, and the hills become the color of ash, and the first stars appear above the eastern ridge, not all at once, but one by one, tentatively, like small fires lit by careful hands at a great distance. This is the hour when the settlement gathers itself. In the Iron Age villages of the Judean hill country, those clusters of stone houses pressed together along the ridge spines, their walls thick enough to hold the cold out in winter and the heat out in summer. The end of daylight is not an ending, but a turning inward. The day's work has been the work of open space, of fields and terrace slopes, of olive groves and grazing routes, and the long walking that ancient pastoral life required. But evening draws everything close. The animals are penned, the children are called, the fires are lit, and it is the fire that becomes the center of everything. In the courtyard of a typical Iron Age dwelling, those broad open spaces enclosed by the house on 3 sides and a low wall on the 4th, where the household's animals sheltered and the family's daily work unfolded. The cooking fire was built with wood gathered through the day, olive branches and dried brush, and whatever the land offered, stacked with the careful economy of people who understood that nothing should be wasted. The fire took slowly at first, the smoke rising pale and thin and almost transparent against the darkening sky, and then it caught properly, and the light it threw was golden and unsteady, moving across the stone walls in patterns that shifted and breathed, that made the rough-hewn rock seem almost soft. Cooking in such a settlement was a slow and patient art. The grinding of grain had already been done, the heavy basalt millstones having done their patient work through the earlier hours, their low, continuous sound one of the ordinary rhythms of the day. Now the dough rested, or was shaped, and flat bread was laid against the hot surface of a clay vessel, set over coals, and it puffed and blistered and filled the air with a smell that was ancient even then, warm and slightly charred, and deeply familiar, a smell that seems to carry within it everything that has ever been called home. Alongside the bread there might be lentils, or dried figs softened by warmth, or olives crushed with oil, or occasionally meat when there was cause, a small animal, carefully prepared, the fat of it rising in the smoke, with a richness that drifted out beyond the courtyard walls and across the cooling air of the hillside. The diet of such communities was modest and largely vegetable, shaped by the agricultural calendar and the discipline of preservation. The people of these villages understood their land's rhythms, the way one understands the character of an old and trusted companion, its generosity in the autumn harvest, its silence in the dry summer months, its slow return to life when the first rains of late autumn softened the cracked soil and turned the hillsides once again to green. The cloth being worked in the firelight was coarse, but not without care. Women and older children sat near the warmth, their fingers moving through tasks of spinning or weaving, or the repair of garments worn by constant use, the wool having come from the household's own flock, the same sheep that now breathed softly in the pen below the courtyard, their wool still smelling faintly of the hillside where they had grazed that afternoon. Spinning in particular was a kind of meditation, the drop spindle turning with a slow and perpetual patience, the raw fleece drawing out into thread by a motion that required almost no conscious thought once learned, and could continue while voices talked and the fire settled and the evening deepened around the workers. The sounds of such a settlement at nightfall were not silence, but they were a gentle kind of sound. the low shifting of animals in their pens, a donkey moving its weight from foot to foot, a goat pressing against the low stone wall with a soft percussion. Somewhere in another courtyard a child was being settled, its small voice rising once and then fading into the quiet murmur of a parent's reassurance. A dog moved along the outer wall in the darkness, its claws a light and intermittent tapping on the stone path. From the direction of the well or the village threshold, a voice carried, not shouting, but lifted just enough to reach another voice that answered in kind. And beneath all of this, if one listened in the way that people who live close to the land learn to listen, there was the sound of the hills themselves, the wind finding its way through the terrace slopes with a soft and sourceless breath, the distant call of an owl settling into the dark wood of a valley oak, the creak and murmur of grasses that had dried through summer and now moved in the cooling air like a conversation that required no translation. The hills of Judah at night were never entirely still. They held within them a kind of low, continuous presence, ancient and unhurried, the sound of a landscape that had been here long before any settlement, and would continue its patient rhythms long after every fire had been banked to coals and covered for the morning. Inside the house, those long rooms divided by rows of pillars, the upper story of wood and packed earth above, the family arranged itself for the night in a way that required no ceremony, because it was simply how things were done. The sleeping mats were unrolled, the clay lamps, small and shallow, filled with olive oil, were carried carefully to wherever light was still needed, their flames extraordinarily small and steady, almost humble, offering just enough warmth of glow to guide a hand or settle a child. They were not the light of brilliance, but the light of sufficiency, and there is a particular kind of peace in that, in having exactly what is needed, and nothing more. By the time the household was fully still, the fire in the courtyard would have settled into a low bed of coals, still orange at the heart, still breathing a thin thread of smoke up into a sky that by now was entirely given over to stars. In the Iron Age hill country, far from the haze of any large settlement, the night sky was extraordinary, a depth of stars so complete that the dark between them seemed almost to recede, the Milky Way crossing overhead like a river of very faint and very distant light, and the familiar stars of the season, the Pleiades, Orion, the bright constant of the south, each holding their ancient positions as they had held them for every generation that had ever looked up from these ridges and felt perhaps that the sky was somehow familiar. The people who built and kept these settlements were not simple, though their lives were close to the land in a way that modern life rarely is. They carried within their communities a rich oral tradition, the stories and songs and legal memory of their people, passed from one generation to the next, through voice and repetition and the particular intimacy of firelight gatherings. Debates among historians continue as to exactly when and how this material was written down, and in what form the earliest records were kept. But the tradition itself, the accumulated memory of a people, was alive and moving through these evening hours, carried in the minds and mouths of those who sat together near the warmth, and talked in the way that all people, in every age, have talked when the work of the day is done and the fire is close, and there is nowhere else to be. This is the world that shaped the story we have been following. These terraced hillsides, these patient fires, these voices talking in the darkness, this sky. Whether the young shepherd of Bethlehem sat in such a courtyard and listened to such voices, or lay out on the hillside and watched such stars, the tradition suggests that something of all this entered him deeply and became part of whatever it was he carried forward into the wider, stranger world that was waiting. And somewhere not far away in the long span of the story, that wider world is stirring, a fugitive moving through a landscape much like this one. The wilderness a darker and less forgiving version of these quiet hills, the fire in that telling smaller and more carefully hidden, the stars overhead the same stars. But that is still ahead. For now there is only the cooling stone and the embers and the breath of the sleeping household and the fire settling gently into its rest. The desert begins where the green hills give out. There is a place east of Bethlehem, east of Hebron, east of all the familiar terraced slopes and cultivated fields, where the land changes its character entirely and without apology. The limestone hills grow paler, bleached by a sun that withholds nothing. The scrub thins, The soil gives way to bare rock and rubble, to sudden dry ravines that plunge toward the salt shores of a great inland sea, sitting far below the level of the wider world. This is the Judean wilderness, the Midbar, a word that in the ancient tongue carries within it the idea of a place spoken to, or perhaps a place where speech itself becomes clear. It is a severe landscape, and a strangely beautiful one, swept by winds that carry no moisture, cut by wadis that run fierce and brown when the rare rains come, and then fall dry and silent for the rest of the year. Ibex pick their way along ledges above vertical drops. Vultures turn slowly in the thermals rising from the canyon floors. At night, the cold comes quickly, and the stars appear in numbers that the settled valleys rarely permit, a vast and indifferent brilliance overhead. It was into this landscape, according to the account that has come down to us, that David fled. The tradition describes a break that must have felt both sudden and long in coming. The tensions within the Court of Saul had grown over months or perhaps years, shifting from the king's dark moods and suspicions into something more openly dangerous. The account tells of spears thrown, of warnings passed through corridors by Jonathan, of a night escape through a window, while a household idol lay beneath blankets to deceive the king's men. By whatever particular path it happened, the story places David outside the protection of the court, outside the walls, out in the open country with whatever he carried on his person, and the knowledge that the king who had made him had now turned fully against him. He went first, the account suggests, to Nob, where priests of the old tradition gave him bread and a weapon, a kindness that would later cost those priests dearly when Saul learned of it. He went to Gath among the Philistines, though that venture grew complicated quickly, and he withdrew, and then he found his way to a cave, the cave of Adullam, in the foothills between the Judean highlands and the coastal plain, a region of limestone formations, and deep natural chambers where a man could shelter and remain unseen by those moving through the valleys below. The name Adullam appears in other ancient records as a recognizable place in the Shephelah lowlands, and the landscape there does indeed offer the kind of terrain where a fugitive might hide and breathe and think. What is remarkable in the tradition, and what sits comfortably alongside what historians understand of the ancient world, is what happened next. People came to him. The account describes them plainly. Those who were in distress, those in debt, those who were bitter of soul. It is a list that sounds both ancient and entirely comprehensible. In any society under pressure, at any period, there are people living at the margins, the overtaxed, the dispossessed, the ones on the wrong side of a debt they cannot repay, those who have quarreled with powerful men and lost. In the Iron Age Levant, such people had few options and little protection. The account tells us that David gathered around him a band of perhaps 400 men, a number that would grow over time to something closer to 600, and that he became their leader and their center. This is not the portrait of a bandit in any simple sense, though the line between bandit and military leader was not always clearly drawn in the ancient Near East. The account presents David and his men as a kind of armed protection company, watching over flocks and settlements in the southern wilderness, known to local landowners who sometimes sought their help. There is a passage in the tradition involving a wealthy man named Nabal and his wife Abigail, set in the region of Carmel in the southern hills, in which David's men have evidently been providing informal protection to Nabal's shepherds during the shearing season, and the expectation of some kind of payment or provision in return is made entirely plain. This is a recognizable social arrangement for the period, armed groups offering security to rural communities in exchange for hospitality and supplies. The Amarna letters from an earlier century and documents from across the ancient Near East describe similar configurations, groups operating in the spaces between settled authority. The geography of this period of David's life, as the tradition preserves it, is the geography of the Deep South. He moves through the wilderness of Ziph, the wilderness of Maon, the strongholds of En-Gedi along the western shore of the Great Salt Sea. En-Gedi is a real place, one of the few true oases along that harsh shoreline, where a spring of fresh water descends through a lush cascade of rock and fern into the salt-heavy air below. Even now it strikes a traveler as startlingly alive in the surrounding desiccation, a place of green and rushing water in a world of pale stone and silence. The tradition places David in the caves above En-Gedi, watching Saul's forces in the valley below, and whatever the precise historical details, the landscape itself makes such a story entirely plausible. Those caves exist. The sightlines are real. A man who knew that terrain well could remain invisible to a larger force that did not. The account gives us moments of near encounter between David and Saul in this southern wilderness, scenes in which David has the opportunity to harm the king and deliberately does not, cutting only the corner of his robe in one telling, taking only a spear and water jug in another. Historians approach these scenes with care, recognizing that they carry theological weight in the tradition, making a point about David's restraint and his refusal to raise his hand against the anointed king. Whether the precise encounters unfolded exactly as described, or whether the tradition has gathered and shaped them into their present form over generations of retelling, is a question that cannot be settled from the outside. What can be said is that David's survival over these years required not only physical endurance, but a quality of judgment, a capacity to hold back, to wait, to read the moment and the mood of those around him. The wilderness itself, that vast and different teacher, would have pressed such qualities forward in anyone who lived long within it. It is said that it was during these years of wandering that some of the poetry attributed to David took shape, or at least drew on the experiences of exactly this kind of life. The texts that later tradition gathered into the great collection of sacred songs speak again and again of desert landscapes, of rocky refuges, of a presence sought in the wilderness, of thirst and shelter, and the cry of a voice in an empty place. Whether or not David composed any of these words himself, and historians debate the authorship and dating of the psalm literature at considerable length, there is something in those images that resonates with what the account describes, a man learning, in the harshest possible school, something about endurance and waiting and the strange mercy of open space. The years in the wilderness were not comfortable years. Food had to be found or negotiated. Loyalties had to be maintained among men who had nothing to lose. The threat of Saul's forces was real and recurring. The political situation was fluid in ways that required constant alertness. And yet the tradition does not present David as broken by this period. It presents him as shaped by it, gradually, the way stone is shaped by weather, not quickly, not without cost, but in ways that go deep. Far to the north, the world was not standing still. The Philistines were pressing their advantage along the coast and into the valleys. Saul's kingdom faced pressures that the king's attention to hunting David in the southern desert could only have made worse. The great reckoning between those two forces, the coastal power of the Philistines and the highland kingdom of Israel, was moving toward a confrontation that would change everything. Though David, moving quietly through the ravines and caves of the south, could not yet have known how completely. For now, the wilderness held him. The stars turned overhead. The ibex moved along their ancient paths on the cliff ledges. Somewhere below, the salt sea glittered in the moonlight, still and heavy and vast, and the small fires of David's encampment burned low in the night, sending their thin threads of smoke up into the cold air, the same familiar warmth that smoke and fire have always given to those who shelter together in uncertain times, waiting, as so many before them had waited, for whatever the morning would bring. The road, south and west, led away from everything familiar. Behind lay the limestone ridges of Judah, the wadis and cave mouths, the thin pasture lands where David had spent his fugitive years moving camp before Saul's soldiers could draw close. Ahead, falling gradually toward the flat and fertile plain, the land changed its character. The air thinned of the high country's sharp cold, the soil darkened. The horizon opened into something wider and more uncertain. This was the approach to Philistine territory, to the coastal lowlands where the great cities sat behind their mud brick walls, where the smell of the sea eventually found you on the westerly wind, salt and distance carried inland across the grain fields of the Shephelah. David, according to the account that has come down to us, made this crossing not once but twice, and the second time he brought 600 men with him, their families trailing behind, a small migration of the desperate and the loyal, moving together toward an uneasy shelter in another people's land. The city of Gath was one of the 5 great Philistine centers, and it sat in a position of considerable power along the lowland routes. Archaeologists working at what is believed to be the site of ancient Gath, a place now called Tel Es-Safi, have uncovered layers of Iron Age occupation that speak of a prosperous and well-organized city, one that traded, that maintained connections with the wider Mediterranean world, that produced pottery and worked metal with evident skill. The Philistines, as the material record and the historical sources together suggest, were not simply warriors pressing against their neighbors' borders. They were administrators, craftspeople, merchants, a people with their own complex life. Into this world, David came as a refugee, seeking the protection of a foreign king. The king of Gath was called Achish, and the tradition describes a relationship between them that is one of the stranger and more morally layered in the whole of David's story. It is said that David had already attempted to find shelter with Achish once before, earlier in his years of flight, and that this first visit had gone badly. The account tells of David pretending madness before the Philistine king, feigning disorder and distress so convincingly that Achish sent him away rather than holding him. Whether that early episode reflects precise history or belongs to the texture of legend that grew around these years, historians cannot say with certainty, but the second approach was different in character entirely. David came now with men and their households, with something resembling a small army, and Achish received him not as a curiosity or a nuisance, but as a political asset. The arrangement that followed was one of those pragmatic accommodations that ancient political life required, and that can sit uneasily in the mind when one considers what David had been before. He had been Saul's celebrated champion, the defender of Israel's borders, the man whose victories over Philistine forces had made him famous enough to be feared by his own king. Now he was living in Gath, eating Philistine bread, sheltered by a Philistine lord. The tradition does not soften this tension or pretend it away. If anything, it lets the strangeness breathe on the page. Achish, for his part, seems to have understood David's value clearly enough. A capable and experienced military commander who had fallen out with Israel's king was precisely the kind of man a rival power might want to keep close. Achish gave David and his company the town of Ziklag to settle in, and here the account becomes unusually concrete in its detail, grounded in the kind of administrative specificity that sometimes marks genuine historical memory. Ziklag's exact location has been debated among scholars. Several sites in the northern Negev have been proposed over the years, but whatever its precise position on the ancient map, the town served as a base of operations, a piece of territory placed under David's stewardship. He and his 600 men and all their families settled there, and for 16 months, the tradition tells us, they lived under Philistine patronage, raiding the southern margins of the land while reporting back to Achish in a way that kept the arrangement mutually useful. This is where the moral texture of the account grows most layered and most quietly remarkable. When Achish asked David what he had been doing on his raids that took him south and east into the lands of desert peoples, the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, David told his patron that he had been raiding Israelite settlements in the southern territories of Judah. The account implies, though without laboring the point, that this was not true. The raids were going elsewhere. David was taking spoil from peoples who had no strong advocate, and leaving no survivors who might carry word back to Gath and correct the story. Achish believed what David told him, and in believing it, concluded that David had so thoroughly broken with his own people that he would make a faithful vassal forever. Whether one reads this as cunning, as moral compromise, as political survival, or as some mixture of all three, historians and readers of the account across many centuries have not settled on a single answer, nor perhaps should they. These were frontier years, outlaw years, years lived at the edge of what structure and belonging meant. The men who followed David into the wilderness and then into Ziklag were themselves people of the margins, in debt, in distress, discontented in one way or another, gathered around a leader whose gifts were evident and whose circumstances were extreme. They were not a standing army with a mandate, they were a community of necessity, and necessity shapes the moral calculus of any age. Daily life in Ziklag during these months would have been shaped by the rhythms that attend any encampment trying to become a settlement. Women tending children, men maintaining weapons, the ordinary texture of cooking and sleeping and watching the perimeter, the care of animals, the dressing of wounds, the maintenance of whatever fabric held a community of 600 fighting men and their dependents together. The surrounding landscape was semi-arid, the southern edges of what the ancients knew as the Negev, a place of thorny scrub and stony ground, where water had to be found and conserved, where the wind moved across open ground without much to interrupt it. Fires at night would have been small and practical, giving warmth against the desert cold that follows desert heat, the darkness pressing close around the edges of whatever light they made. There is a particular quality to a fire burning at the edge of known territory, when the land beyond the circle of light belongs to uncertainty, when morning might bring news that changes everything. The men and women at Ziklag lived in that quality, and it must have been felt in small ways throughout each day, in the care with which watches were kept, in the way conversation around an evening fire might lower itself instinctively when the wind carried sounds from the open ground. They were guests in someone else's land, dependent on a foreign king's goodwill, at a distance from everything that had defined their lives before this stretch of wandering began. The arrangement did not resolve itself in the way Achish might have imagined. When the Philistine lords gathered their forces to march against Israel, the campaign that would lead, in the account's telling, to the death of Saul on the slopes of Jezreel, Achish brought David and his men as part of his contingent, evidently confident in the loyalty that the months at Ziklag had cemented. But the other Philistine commanders were less certain. They looked at David and his men marching with their army and asked the question that the whole arrangement had always quietly contained. Could this man be trusted in battle against his own people? The pressure from his fellow lords was enough that Achish, reluctantly and with evident warmth toward David, sent him back to Ziklag. And David went, returned south through the flat lowlands and the thinning air of the Negev margin, back to the town that had been his borrowed home. What he found when he arrived there is another part of the account, and it belongs to the turbulent close of these Ziklag years rather than to their daily texture. For now it is enough to sit with the image of this stretch of time, a man of considerable gifts and a still uncertain future, living between worlds, neither fully of Israel nor truly of Philistia, finding his way in the margins with patience and with whatever wisdom the long years of open country had given him. The fires at Ziklag burned on many such evenings, small and steady against the southern dark, and when the wind came across the Negev, it carried the smell of dust and dry grass from the highlands to the east, from the direction of Judah, from the hills that had shaped him long before any of this had begun. The shepherd landscape waited, patient as it had always been, ready to be returned to in quieter hours, in the slow unwinding of memory and rest. The rain comes before you see it. It arrives first as a particular heaviness in the air, a softening of the light over the western ridges, a stillness that settles among the limestone outcrops as if the land itself is holding its breath. Then the smell, that ancient, mineral, almost sacred smell of water meeting dry stone, drifts up from the valleys and across the terrace slopes, and the shepherd standing on the hillside lifts his face toward it before the first drop has even fallen. He has learned to read this language. The land has been teaching it for thousands of years. This is the Judean highlands in the season of early rain, the Yoreh, the gift that comes in the long golden weeks of autumn, after the parched summer has bleached every grass stem white and driven the last moisture deep into the cracked earth. The hills here run roughly north to south like the spines of ancient creatures sleeping beneath the soil, ridge after ridge folded and refolded over uncountable millennia, their flanks terraced by generations of farmers who piled stone upon stone to hold the thin red earth against the pull of rain and gravity. Those terraces are among the quietest monuments the ancient world ever made. No inscription, no dedication, only the patient arithmetic of labor. Stone lifted, stone placed, soil held, grain grown, family fed. They were already old in David's time. They would be ancient when the Romans came. Some of them stand still. The rain, when it finally arrives in earnest, does not fall the way it falls in softer, greener lands. It falls with intention. It strikes the limestone and the bare earth in fat, purposeful drops that raise small puffs of dust at first, a brief and beautiful contradiction. Water and dust momentarily coexisting before the earth surrenders and darkens. The rivulets begin almost at once, tracing their familiar paths through the rock, following channels so well worn that they seem preordained, as if the water is only ever returning somewhere it is always known. Down through the wadis they go, those dry seasonal valleys that spend most of the year as pale, stony corridors of silence. And for a few hours or a few days, they become something rushing and alive, brown with the good red soil they carry down toward the lower land. A shepherd in this landscape learns that the terraces above the wadis are reliable, that the southern-facing slopes dry fastest after rain and offer the earliest new growth, that the northern faces hold their moisture longer and can be saved for the drier weeks of late winter when the southern grass has already thinned. These are not lessons written down. They pass from father to son in the walking of the roots, in the quiet pointing out of landmarks, this particular fig tree at the edge of someone's field, that leaning white rock where the path bends west, the place where a spring rises for 3 months of the year and is gone the rest of the time. The knowledge is embodied, carried in the legs and the eyes and the nose, as much as in any memory that can be put into words. The ancient grazing routes of the highland move in broad seasonal arcs. In the wet season, the upper pastures open and the flocks can spread across the higher ground, where the grass comes in thick and green between the outcrops of pale stone. As the spring advances and the rains ease away into the long Mediterranean summer, the shepherd begins to think about movement, about the lower valleys, the places where water still runs underground and feeds a persistent green, the margins of fields where stubble can be gleaned after harvest. The sheep and the goats know the routes almost as well as the shepherd does. They have been walking then for longer, in a sense, their ancestors following these same contours in some version of the same season rhythm, since the earliest herding peoples brought their flocks into these hills. The sounds of this landscape are particular and unhurried. There is the sound of hooves on stone, a soft, irregular percussion, almost musical in its randomness. There is the sound of bells, not the large, clamorous bells of later ages, but small, beaten bronze bells hung at the necks of the lead animals, their tone a gentle, domestic clinking that carries just far enough across the hillside to tell the shepherd where his flock has drifted while he stood looking west at the weather. There is the sound of wind through the sparse vegetation, through the clumps of thorny burnet and the tufts of wild thyme, and the occasional stand of oak or terebinth that has survived in some sheltered fold of the landscape. The terebinth in particular, the tree known as the Elah in the old language of these hills, spreads its branches low and wide and casts a shade that feels almost architectural, a room made of shadow and dappled light in the middle of an otherwise open hillside. In the afternoons when the light thickens and turns from white to gold, the shadows of the western ridges begin to creep across the terraces below them, and the temperature drops with a swiftness that seems almost generous after the severity of the midday heat. The stones, which have been radiating warmth since morning, hold their heat a little longer, and a shepherd leaning against a sun-warmed limestone outcrop in the early evening finds a particular comfort there, the stone giving back what it has spent all day absorbing, a kind of slow and wordless exchange between the living body and the ancient earth. The villages of this highland world were small, and their light at evening was small too. Oil lamps flickering in the windows of houses built from the same pale stone as the hillside itself, so that the settlements seemed to grow organically from the landscape, rather than being placed upon it. The smell of cooking, lentils, barley, dried figs, the occasional sharp scent of roasting meat on a festival evening, drifted out past the low doorways and hung in the still evening air. Dogs barked at the edges of the settlement, establishing the perimeter of the known world, and then fell silent, and the silence that followed was full and dense and complete, in the way that only deep rural silence can be, a silence in which you can hear the movement of a single sheep 50 paces away, or the cry of a nightjar beginning its evening flight over the rocky slopes. It is into this silence that the Psalms seem to belong most naturally, when you know something of the landscape that shaped the tradition from which they grew. Whether or not the specific poems attributed to David were composed by him, or shaped by later hands, or gathered from an older treasury of song, the images they carry are unmistakably those of this particular world, the shepherd and the flock, the still water and the green pasture, the rock and the shadow and the valley, the long watchful night and the mercy of morning. The poetry breathes the air of these hills. It holds the smell of rain on limestone. It knows what it is to stand alone on a hillside in the dark, with nothing overhead but stars, and nothing around but the breathing of sleeping animals and the occasional distant sound of wind moving through the wadis far below. The stars here, on a clear winter night, after the rain has washed the air clean, are extravagant. There are more of them than seems possible, and they are close in a way that they are not in places where the light of cities has softened and diminished the darkness. The Milky Way stretches across the highland sky like a slow river of pale light, and a person lying on their back on the flat warm stone of a threshing floor, looking up, can feel the particular vertigo of genuine darkness, the sense that up and down had become less certain, that the boundary between the human and the vast is thinner than usual. This is the landscape that made certain ways of thinking feel natural, not as doctrine, not as theology debated in schoolrooms, but as direct experience, the smallness of the individual against the scope of the sky, the dependability of the seasons against the brevity of any single life, the way the land gives and withholds according to its own rhythms, and asks nothing in return for its beauty except attention. Attention and patience, the great pastoral virtues, the virtues of someone who has spent long years watching over something small and vulnerable in a large and sometimes harsh world, and learned in that watching something that could not have been learned any other way. The rain that began the evening eases now toward midnight, softening from its earlier purposeful fall to a whisper, a barely there mist that drifts across the terraces and gathers in silver beads along the edges of every stone. The wadis are quieter now, their earlier urgency settling into a low and steady murmur. The flocks are gathered close, their wool dark with moisture, their breathing slow and even. And somewhere in the story that has come down to us, after all the years of wilderness and flight and survival that the next chapters carry, it is this particular silence, this smell of rain on old stone, this darkness full of stars, that may be what the fugitive king remembered most deeply when memory turned, as it always does, toward the first home. The fires had burned low across the camp at Ziklag, and the air smelled of ash and exhaustion. And it was into that gray and weary stillness that the messenger arrived, his clothes torn, dust pressed into the creases of his face, his sandals worn through from hard traveling across difficult ground. The news he carried had already happened, somewhere far to the north, on the slopes and plains around a place called Jezreel, in the broad, fertile valley that opens between the hill country of Samaria and the rising shoulders of Mount Gilboa. It had already happened before anyone in the south knew to grieve, and the distance between the event and the knowledge of it seemed in that moment like a kind of cruelty, the way a fire burns down a house before the people sleeping in it understand what the warmth means. The account that has come down to us tells of a battle that was already lost before it began, in the way that some battles are. The Philistine forces had gathered in great number along the valley floor and the surrounding highlands, assembling from their coastal cities with their iron weapons and their superior organization, and the army of Saul had looked across at them and found itself afraid. The tradition records that Saul, in that fear, sought guidance from prophets who did not answer, from dreams that gave him nothing, and finally, the account tells from a woman in the village of Endor who was said to have the ability to commune with the dead. The story goes that Saul asked her to call up the spirit of Samuel, the prophet who had anointed him and then turned from him, and that what came was not comfort, but further darkness, a voice from the earth confirming what he perhaps already knew, that the kingdom was departing from him, that the day would not go well. Whether one understands that strange and melancholy scene as vision or dream or exhausted imagination, it belongs to the texture of Saul's end, a man who had once stood tall above other men, who had driven back enemies and unified tribes, and carried the weight of a new kind of institution in a world where kingship in Israel was still an untested thing, now sleepless on the night before a battle he did not believe he could win, seeking counsel from shadows. The Battle of Mount Gilboa, as historians have come to call it, appears to have been a decisive and terrible defeat. The Israelite forces were broken, scattered across the hillside, and Saul's sons, Jonathan among them, Jonathan who had loved David with a loyalty that the texts describe as extraordinary, fell in the fighting. The account tells that Saul himself, wounded by archers, asked his armor-bearer to run him through, so that the Philistines would not capture him and make sport of him, and that when the armor-bearer refused, Saul fell upon his own sword. The account continues. Found his body and the bodies of his sons, and took them to the city of Bethshean, where they hung them upon the city walls. A public display of their victory in the ancient manner of such things, a way of marking dominance written not in words, but in the sight of the defeated. It is said that the men of Jabesh Gilead, a city in the Transjordan that Saul had once rescued early in his reign, and which had never forgotten that kindness, walked through the night to retrieve the bodies from those walls, and gave them burial with care and with fasting, a loyalty to the dead that the texts record without commentary, as though even the narrator pauses at such faithfulness. David, when the messenger reached him in the south, had not been on that battlefield. He had been turned back from the Philistine assembly before the fighting, prevented by the suspicions of the other Philistine commanders from participating in a campaign against his own people. And the texts note this without resolution, allowing the ambiguity of his position to simply rest there, unresolved. He had returned to Ziklag to find it raided and burned by the Amalekites, had pursued them and recovered what was taken, and was still in the aftermath of that ordeal when the torn-clothed messenger arrived with news of Gilboa. What happened next is one of the moments that has drawn readers and historians back to David across 3,000 years, because the response attributed to him does not read like political calculation. It reads like grief. The account tells that David and all the men with him tore their clothes, the ancient gesture of mourning, the body expressing what words cannot yet form, and wept and fasted until evening. And then, in the tradition, David composed a lament. Scholars debate its origins, and historians of ancient Near Eastern literature have long studied it in the context of other mourning poetry from the region. But the text itself presents it as David's own, dictated in the rawness of his loss, and instructed to be taught to the people of Judah. The lament, as it has come down to us, is addressed to the mountains of Gilboa, and it carries within it the kind of specific, personal grief that resists easy formality. David does not mourn Saul and Jonathan as abstractions of kingship and alliance. He mourns them as people he knew, as men whose absence now shapes the world differently. He calls them beloved and lovely in their lives, and says that in death they were not divided. He speaks of Jonathan in terms of extraordinary tenderness, of a love, he says, surpassing the love of women, a line that has generated centuries of interpretation, and which the text itself simply offers without elaboration, as though the depth of it needs no further explaining. There is something in that lament that historians find genuinely striking, because it praises Saul, a man whom David had fled, whom he had feared and evaded, and from whom he had run for years, is remembered in the poem not as his persecutor, but as the anointed of Israel, as a warrior of beauty and power, as someone worth mourning. The daughters of Israel are asked to weep over him. The poem grieves what is lost, without rehearsing the difficulties of what was. Whether David composed those words precisely as they appear in the ancient text, or whether they were shaped by later poets working in his name, or some combination of the two, historians cannot say with certainty. But the poem exists, and it is old, and it carries within it the weight of something that was genuinely felt. The ancient Near East was not without its tradition of royal lament poetry. Other cultures of the region composed formal mourning texts, but this one has an intimacy, a private quality beneath its public function that has led readers across many ages to sense something personal within it. What the death of Saul meant in political terms was enormous, and the tradition does not pretend otherwise. The throne that had stood in Israel, however uncertainly, was now vacant. The army that had defended the northern territories was broken and scattered. The Philistines had achieved something significant, and the vacuum that opened across the Israelite hill country in the wake of Gilboa would need to be filled by someone. David was a man of ability and reputation, already gathering loyalty, already having demonstrated qualities that made people follow him. The path from Ziklag to Hebron to something larger was beginning to become visible. But the tradition pauses here and holds the grief before moving into any of that. It gives the lament its time. It allows the mountains to be addressed, allows the dew and the rain to be refused to Gilboa in the mourner's irrational wish, allows Jonathan to be missed, simply without agenda. And in the quiet of that literary pause, whatever followed, the negotiations, the rival claims, the careful accumulation of power, is held at a distance, not yet summoned. The fires that night in the south would have been small, the kind that offer warmth without much light, the kind that men sit around when they do not have much to say. The stars over the Judean lowlands in that era were very bright, unpolluted by anything, and the darkness between them was very complete. The sound of a fire in such conditions, the occasional soft collapse of an ember, the thin movement of air through dry grass nearby, would have been a companion to anyone sitting awake with a fresh grief, too large to understand all at once, asking to be carried forward slowly, in stages, the way mourning always requires. Tomorrow, and the days after it, would begin to move David northward toward Hebron, toward the long and patient gathering of a kingdom. But that is a journey to settle into gently, when the mind is rested and the hour is quiet enough to receive it. For now the embers rest, and the hills are still, and the night asks nothing more of you. The road to Hebron climbs through limestone hills that have been pale and warm and dusty since before any written record survived to tell us so, and in the early Iron Age, when the world that produced David was still young, those hills would have felt very much as they feel in the imagination now, wide and quiet, threaded with ancient paths worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet, the terrace slopes dropping away on either side into shallow valleys where wild herbs grew between the stones, and the air carried, even in the dry season, some faint memory of the last rain. It is to Hebron that the account turns now, in the aftermath of grief and mourning, in the slow time after Saul's death on the slopes of Jezreel. The tradition tells us that David, having received word of the battle and having mourned, was given direction, through the practice of seeking divine guidance, recorded in the older texts as consultation with an oracle, to go south, into Judah, into the territory he knew, into the landscape that had shaped him from boyhood. And so it is said that he gathered his household and his followers, those men who had been with him through the long wilderness years, and they moved together through the hills toward Hebron, the city that sat at the heart of the southern highlands, elevated above the surrounding country, old beyond any easy reckoning, a place where the deep memory of the land seemed to concentrate itself in the cool shade of its stones. Hebron is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in all of that ancient world. Archaeologists working through its layers have found evidence of settlement reaching back thousands of years before David's time, though the city of the Iron Age, the one David would have known, was a modest thing by the standards of great ancient capitals, a hilltop town of stone houses and narrow streets, of storage jars and olive presses, of cooking fires and the smell of animals and grain, surrounded by the agricultural terraces that made the highlands productive, sustained by the deep wells that had made habitation possible in that dry country for so very long. It was not a city of palaces or grand monuments in the way that Egypt or Mesopotamia understood such things. It was a working town, a regional center, a place of weight and significance in the social and political geography of Judah, and it was there that the account tells us the men of Judah came to David and anointed him king over the house of Judah. Rest for a moment in the texture of that phrase, the house of Judah, not yet all Israel, not yet the unified kingdom that later tradition would remember and celebrate. The early years of David's kingship, according to the historical accounts that have come down to us, were years not of sudden triumph, but of patient incremental consolidation, a process as slow and deliberate as the building of one of those limestone terraces on the hillside, stone placed upon stone with care, the whole structure dependent on each part holding its place. The political situation following Saul's death was, by any reading of the texts, complicated. The northern tribes, the larger and in some ways more powerful part of the old Israelite confederation, did not immediately turn to David. The tradition tells us that Abner, Saul's commander, a formidable figure who had survived the battle at Jezreel, took Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, or as he appears in some textual traditions, Eshbal, and established him as a rival claimant to the throne, ruling over the northern territories from east of the Jordan River. Historians debate the precise chronology and geography of this arrangement, and the sources are not always easy to reconcile. But what comes through clearly in the account is the picture of a divided people in the years following Saul's death, two centers of power pulling in different directions. The unity that later tradition would prize, still something to be negotiated, still fragile, still uncertain. For 7 years and 6 months, according to the account, David reigned in Hebron over Judah. 7 years. Let that settle quietly. 7 years of governance from this limestone hilltop. 7 years of building relationships and alliances, of administering justice, and managing the complex loyalties of a region where clan and kinship and ancient obligations shaped every political reality. The texts give us glimpses of this period, mentions of diplomacy, of negotiations, of small conflicts between David's forces and those loyal to the house of Saul, none of them described as great or glorious battles, but as the grinding, careful work of competing powers finding the edges of their influence. The account tells of Abner eventually seeking to transfer his loyalty to David, of a meeting at Hebron that seemed to promise resolution, and then of the violent intervention of Joab, David's own commander, who killed Abner in revenge for a brother's death, a death that the text records as deeply unwelcome to David, who mourned publicly and conspicuously, walking in the funeral procession, singing lament, performing grief in the visible, social way that the ancient world required of those who wished to distance themselves from an act of political violence. These are not clean stories. The account does not offer them as such. They are the stories of a world where power was real and its acquisition was rarely simple, where the men around a king had their own agendas and their own scores to settle, where the intentions of a leader and the actions of those in his service did not always align. The tradition preserves all of this without smoothing it entirely away, and there is something in that preservation worth noticing quietly, in the way one notices an imperfection in an ancient piece of pottery that makes it more clearly the work of human hands. And then the account tells us Ishbosheth was killed by 2 of his own officers, men whose motivations the text does not quite clarify, and the political landscape shifted. The elders of the northern tribes came to Hebron. They came with memory and with argument, reminding David, the account says, that even in the time of Saul, it had been David who led their armies, that the ties between them were not new. It is said that a covenant was made at Hebron, before witnesses, in the old way, and that David was anointed again, a third anointing, if one counts from the quiet, secret moment in Bethlehem with Samuel, this time as king over all Israel. There is something almost architectural about the way this moment is arranged in the tradition. The secret beginning in a shepherd's family, the years of service and suffering, the partial kingship in the south, and then, at last, the fuller recognition, not seized but granted, not imposed but offered, the result of years of patience and demonstrated fitness in the eyes of those who would follow. Whether history unfolded precisely in these smooth narrative contours, scholars have long debated. The political reality behind the tradition was almost certainly messier, more contingent, more shaped by accident and personality than any single account can fully capture. But the broad outline, David and Hebron, ruling Judah first, then drawing the northern allegiance over the course of years, is consistent with what the archaeology of the period and the nature of Iron Age political organization would lead us to expect. Hebron itself would have held the weight of all of this quietly, as old cities do. The hills around it would have looked much as they looked to the shepherd boy moving through them in his earliest years, the light on the stone changing through the hours of the day, from sharp and white at noon to the softer, warmer color that comes in the late afternoon, when the shadows lengthen in the terraced valleys and the air begins to cool, and the first cook fires send their thin threads of smoke up into the still sky. It is said that David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and that he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years in Jerusalem and the 7 in Hebron, 40 years in total by the tradition's reckoning. But Jerusalem was still ahead. The great defining act of David's kingship, the choice of a new city, a city belonging not to any single tribe but to the king himself, had not yet come. It was waiting in the north, on its ancient hilltop, among its limestone walls and deep-cut water shafts, patient as stone, quiet as a city can be in the last still hour before dawn, when the fires have burned low, and the whole world seems to pause in the darkness before turning toward morning. For now Hebron held the king, and the king held his counsel in its shade, and the hills breathed slowly around them in the old way of hills everywhere, and the fires in the courtyards of the stone houses sent their light upward into the cool evening air, warm and steady and unhurried, like something that had always been there and intended to remain. The stone remembers everything. That is perhaps the first thing to understand about Jerusalem, that the rock on which it sits is not merely a foundation, but a presence, a gray-gold limestone that has been shaped by wind and rain and the slow, patient work of centuries into something that feels almost deliberately formed, as though the hill itself chose to be here, chose to rise just so above the valleys that curl around it on three sides, like cupped hands. Stand at the edge of those valleys in the still hours before morning, and you will feel it, the way the hill holds the darkness a little longer than the surrounding land, the way the first light, when it comes, seems to arrive not from the sky alone, but from within the stone itself, warming slowly, releasing a pale amber glow that has no single source, but simply fills the air between the terrace slopes and the old walls. The city that would one day bear the weight of so much human longing was, in David's time and long before it, a modest hilltop settlement, ancient by any measure, but not grand, not vast, perched on a narrow ridge between the Kidron Valley to the east and the Tyropoin to the west, with the Valley of Hinnom sweeping around below the southern end like a long exhaled breath. The ridge is surprisingly small when you trace it in your mind, perhaps half a kilometer in length, perhaps less, and yet it commanded the approaches between north and south, between the hill country and the lowlands, in a way that made it strategically precious. Water, too, was there, rising from the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley below the eastern slope, a reliable source in a dry land, and water in the ancient Near East was never a small thing. It was life itself, quietly bubbling up from the limestone, cold even in summer, tasting faintly of mineral depth. Long before any Israelite king looked upon it, the settlement on this hill was already old. Egyptian records from the 19th and 18th centuries before the Common Era mention a place called Jerusalem, a name that likely carried some meaning related to foundation or peace, though scholars are careful to note the uncertainty in such ancient etymologies. The texts known as the Amarna letters, written roughly in the 14th century before the Common Era, contain correspondence from a local ruler of the city who wrote anxiously to the Egyptian pharaoh, seeking support, describing a volatile and shifting world of competing small kingdoms across the Levant. That ruler's world, his city, his limestone ridge, his spring, would not have looked entirely unlike the one into which David eventually entered, though centuries of slow accumulation lay between them. In the account that has come down to us through the tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures, Jerusalem in the time just before David was held by a people called the Jebusites, one of many groups inhabiting the hill country of Canaan during the early Iron Age. The nature of Jebusite culture and identity is something historians continue to examine carefully, drawing on what archaeology has uncovered and what the ancient texts preserve, though the picture remains incomplete, as it so often does when we look this far back through time. What seems clear is that the settlement was walled and defensible. The geography alone would have encouraged fortification, and that it stood apart from the territory already associated with the Israelite tribes who had settled the surrounding highlands in the preceding centuries. The limestone walls, whatever their precise form in that era, would have been warm to the touch in the afternoon hours, having drunk in the sun since morning. The stones used in ancient Levantine construction were often quarried from the very bedrock beneath the settlement, so that city and hill were made of the same material, continuous in substance if not in shape. Running your hand along such a wall in the late afternoon, you would feel not just warmth, but texture. The slightly uneven surface of worked stone, the small gaps where mortar had aged, the occasional smooth patch where hands had passed across it 10,000 times before yours. There is something profoundly humbling in that kind of touch. The sense of continuity with all the unnamed people who stood in approximately the same place and felt approximately the same warmth under the same retreating light. The Kidron Valley below the eastern slope holds its own deep silence in the early morning. Even now, even after all that has happened on and around this hill, the valley floor in the quiet hours before the city fully wakes carries a stillness that seems geological in its depth, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, that makes the rustle of a bird in the brush below sound unexpectedly clear and close. In ancient times, without the accumulated layers of sound that centuries of habitation bring, that silence would have been deeper still. The spring emerging from the rock below the slope would have been audible at night, a faint musical sound, water finding its way through limestone, constant and unhurried, belonging to no particular season or rain or story. It is said in the tradition that when David and his forces came to Jerusalem, the Jebusites were confident in their hilltop stronghold, confident enough, the account tells us, to taunt the approaching forces with a kind of defiant humor, suggesting that even the blind and the lame could hold the city against them. What followed, the taking of the city, the means by which entry was gained, whether through the water shaft or some other approach, has been the subject of considerable archaeological and historical discussion, and the details remain genuinely uncertain. What the tradition preserves is the outcome, that David took the stronghold, that it became his city, called in the account the City of David, and that he made it the center of something new. The choice was politically elegant in ways that the ancient world would have understood immediately. Jerusalem sat at the boundary between the northern and southern territories, between the tribes of Israel and those of Judah. It belonged in a sense to neither, having been outside the settled territories of either group. By making it his capital, the tradition suggests, David was establishing a neutral ground, a royal city that did not carry the tribal associations of Hebron in the south or any of the northern centers. It would be a new thing, a city of the king, a place where the crown itself was rooted, rather than any particular lineage or clan. Whether this was conscious political strategy or the outcome of other pressures, historians continue to weigh the evidence carefully. What the archaeology of the site has revealed, layer by patient layer, is a place of extraordinary continuous occupation, centuries beneath centuries, each generation building on the rubble and memory of those before, so that the hill itself grew slowly taller with human accumulation. The large stone step structure that archaeologists have uncovered in the area of the oldest settlement is among the most significant finds from this period, though its precise function and the exact phase of its construction remain subjects of scholarly discussion. It speaks, in the language of stone and engineering, to a settlement with organizational capacity, with the ability to marshal labor and intention across time. And the stone, always the stone. It endures in a way that wood and cloth, and even written words sometimes cannot. In the quiet of the early evening, when the light shifts from gold to rose to a deep cooling blue above the ridge, the limestone surfaces of the hill seem to hold a last warmth in their faces, releasing the day's heat slowly and gently into the cooling air. Somewhere below, the Gihon spring is still moving through the rock, still finding its way as it always has, indifferent to dynasties and devotions, simply present, simply flowing. It is from this place, this warm stone hill, this ancient ridge with its deep valleys and its cold spring and its long memory, that the story of David's kingship will begin to unfold in earnest. Not the wandering years, not the wilderness or the Philistine courts, or the slow gathering of power in Hebron, but something more settled, more deliberate, the attempt to make a kingdom with Jerusalem at its heart. That story, the bringing of something sacred into the city, the weaving together of political and spiritual life on this particular hill, above this particular valley, begins in the chapter that comes gently after this one. For now, though, let the stone hold what it has always held. Let the valley be dark and quiet. Let the spring move through the rock in the way it has moved for 10,000 years and more, unhurried, faithful, barely audible in the deepening night. The hill is still, the walls are warm, the stars above the ridge have always been these same stars, looked upon by every soul who ever stood here, and felt as you might feel now, the strange and gentle weight of time. Rest in that quietness. The city was quiet before it began. Jerusalem sat in its high, stony stillness, as it had for centuries before David ever looked upon its walls. And for a little while longer it remained that way, a captured place still finding its new identity, its streets still holding the memory of the Jebusite inhabitants who had walked them, its cisterns cut deep into the limestone by hands that had no knowledge of the man who now called it his own. The morning light came in from the east, as it always did, sliding over the ridge of the Mount of Olives and falling across the terraced slopes in long golden plains, touching the rough-hewn stone with a warmth that made the city seem, for a moment, as ancient and as permanent as the hills themselves. And it was into this particular kind of morning, the account tells us, that preparations began for something that had not yet happened anywhere in the land: the bringing of the most sacred object the Israelite people possessed into the city that David had chosen as the heart of his kingdom. The Ark of the Covenant, as the tradition describes it, was a chest of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, fitted with carrying poles, so that it need never be touched directly by human hands. It held within it, according to the account that has come down through the centuries, the stone tablets inscribed at Sinai, and it was understood to represent the very presence of the God of Israel in a way that made it unlike any other object in the known world of its people. It was not merely symbolic in the way that later ages might understand the word. In the ancient Near Eastern world, divine presence was located, was housed, was specific and spatially real. Neighboring peoples carried the images of their gods into battle, placed them in their temples, tended them as one might tend a sovereign. The Ark occupied a comparable role in the Israelite imagination, though the tradition insists it bore no image, only absence and presence together, a sacred emptiness that was somehow also the fullness of the divine. For the people who carried it, and for the king who wished to bring it to his new city, it was the thread that connected the wandering past to the settled present, the wilderness years to the stone streets of Jerusalem. It had not been housed in any permanent place for a long time. The accounts suggest it had moved through various sanctuaries and stopping points across the land of the Israelites, held at Shiloh in earlier generations, captured by the Philistines in the disastrous battle at Aphek, then returned after a troubled sojourn among the coastal cities, and finally resting at a place called Kiriath Jearim, in the house of a man named Abinadab, where it is said to have remained for many decades, while the political life of the Israelite tribes shifted and struggled and eventually consolidated itself into the shape of a kingdom. It had waited there, in a sense, through the whole long reign of Saul, through the wars and the fractures and the grief. And now David, newly established in his highland city, turned his attention toward it. The tradition describes a first attempt to move the ark that did not go as intended. A new cart was built, and the ark was placed upon it, and a procession set out with music and celebration. But the account tells of a man named Uzzah, who reached out to steady the ark when the oxen stumbled, and who died in that moment. And the story goes that David was both frightened and angry, uncertain what this meant, and he left the ark in the care of a man named Obed-Edom of Gath for 3 months before attempting the journey again. Historians and scholars have debated the meaning of this episode across many centuries, and it sits in the narrative with a kind of irreducible strangeness that no single interpretation quite smooths away. What it does convey, in the texture of the tradition, is that the movement of this object was understood to be serious beyond measure, attended by forces that could not be managed with simple logistical confidence, demanding a reverence that went deeper than ceremony. When the second procession set out, the account describes something altogether different in character, a celebration of such intensity and fullness that it has echoed through the memory of the tradition ever since. There were sacrifices offered, the story tells us, after the ark had been carried 6 paces without incident, a detail so specific and so particular that it feels rooted in something real, some memory of a moment when relief and joy broke through and the procession paused to give thanks before it had even properly begun. And then it moved on, with singing and the music of lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets, a long column of people making their way through the hill country toward the city, the sound of them rising and falling with the contours of the land, voices mixing with the clatter of instruments against the wide open air of the Judean highlands. The image the account gives of David himself in this procession is one of the most vivid and humanly immediate in the entire tradition. It is said that he danced before the ark with all his might, wearing a linen ephod, a simple priestly garment rather than royal robes, leaping and celebrating with what the text describes as an abandon that seemed to his wife Michal, watching from a window above, as undignified for a king. The exchange that follows in the account between David and Michal carries within it something of the ancient tension between the sacred and the political, between the person who forgets himself entirely in the presence of the holy and the person who holds carefully to the requirements of decorum and rank. David's response, the tradition preserves, was that he would be humbler still. Whatever one makes of the moral dimensions of that exchange, the image of the king dancing in the street, his fine robes set aside, his body moving without calculation or reserve, is one that has stayed in the collective memory for nearly 3,000 years. There is something in it that feels true to a particular kind of human experience, the moment when the formal self dissolves and only the responding, feeling creature remains. The ark was brought into the city and set within the tent that David had prepared for it, and burnt offerings and peace offerings were made. And the account tells us that David himself blessed the people in the name of his God, and distributed bread and portions of meat and cakes of raisins to the whole assembly, to every man and every woman, before the people returned to their homes. It was, in the telling of it, a day of extraordinary communion, the king and the people and the sacred object all gathered in the same space, the city for the first time holding within its walls something that connected it to the long story of this people's identity. What this event meant in its ancient context is something that historians have thought about carefully, and from several directions at once. At the level of politics and power, the move was shrewd. David had built his kingdom through the gathering of separate tribal loyalties, the bringing together of Judah and the northern tribes into something that had not existed before in quite this form. Jerusalem was a city with no prior tribal allegiance. It had not belonged to any Israelite tribe, and it owed nothing politically to any of them. By making it the home of the ark, David was making it the sacred center as well as the political one, tying the religious imagination of all the tribes to his chosen city. It is worth sitting with that observation quietly, without judgment. Ancient kings and leaders routinely wove together the sacred and the political, and this was simply the idiom in which power and devotion both found expression. The tradition does not present it as cynical, and perhaps it was not. Perhaps the calculation and the genuine impulse existed together, as they so often do, in human hearts. And then there is the level of the personal, the interior. The account, whatever its complex history of composition, preserves a portrait of a man who wanted the presence of the sacred close to him, who felt the distance between himself and the object of his devotion as a kind of incompleteness. The city was his, the throne was established, the enemies had been pushed back to their borders, and still something was not yet in its right place until the ark had come through the gates and been set under a roof, even a temporary one, in the heart of Jerusalem. The fires in the city burned lower as the day drew toward its close, the smell of the sacrifice still hanging faintly in the cool evening air, mixing with wood smoke and the dry scent of the limestone hills. The people had gone home with their bread and their portions, the music had stilled, the dancing was done. The ark rested in its tent in the gathering dark, and the city that held it was no longer quite the same city it had been that morning. Something had shifted, had settled, had arrived, and somewhere in that changed Jerusalem, in the quiet after the celebration, the shape of what would come next was already beginning to form in the mind of a king who could never quite be satisfied with what he had already built. The fire burns lower now, and the city sleeps beneath its own weight of stone and memory, and somewhere in the streets of Jerusalem, the oil lamps gutter softly in their niches, casting their small warm circles against walls that were already old when David first walked among them. It is in this middle season of his reign that we find him now, not the boy on the hillside, not the fugitive in the wilderness, not even the dancing figure leading the ark through the city gates, but the king in full, the administrator and commander and diplomat, the man who must translate the energy of his improbable rise into something that might endure beyond a single lifetime. The ancient Near East of the 10th century before the Common Era was not a quiet place. It was a world of shifting powers, of old empires cooling at their edges and new ones not yet fully formed. And in that particular interval of history, the central highlands of the Levant offered something rare, a moment of relative openness, a space in which a capable and determined kingdom could extend itself outward in ways that might have been impossible a century earlier, when Egyptian power still pressed down across the region, or a century later, when the great Assyrian machine would begin its grinding westward expansion. The account that has come down to us, woven through the later books of Samuel and confirmed in fragmentary ways by archaeology and by the records of neighboring peoples, suggests that David moved into this interval with considerable energy and effect. To the west, the Philistines remained a constant presence, those well-organized city-states along the coastal plain whose ironworking and military sophistication had long made them formidable neighbors. The tradition records that early in the consolidated reign, perhaps not long after the taking of Jerusalem, there were further engagements with the Philistines in the valleys and lowlands that separated the hill country from the coast. The accounts speak of battles in places called Rephaim and Gob, names that echo now like stones dropped into still water, and the story goes that David's forces prevailed in these encounters, pushing back the Philistine reach into the interior and securing the approaches to his new capital. Whether this represented a final decisive defeat of Philistine power or simply a successful containment of their expansion into the hills, historians debate with care and nuance, for the Philistines continued to exist as a distinct culture for centuries after, their cities alive in trading and building. But the pressure on the Central Highlands seems to have eased, and that easing was itself a kind of victory, a slow release of tension that had defined Israelite life since before the days of Saul. The picture that the account draws is of campaigns against the Moabites, who occupied the high plateau country across the Jordan and the Dead Sea, and against the Ammonites further north, whose capital sat near the river Jabbok, in the region later known as Rabbah. The Ammonite War, according to the tradition, was a long and costly affair, stretching across more than one campaigning season, involving the army under the command of Joab, that complex, capable, and at times troubling figure who served as David's general throughout so much of the reign. It is said that the siege of Rabbah itself was a protracted business. The army encamped before those walls through the heat of the eastern summer, while David remained in Jerusalem. And it is around this siege that some of the most difficult passages of the traditional narrative gather, but those belong to another chapter, another night, and for now we rest with the broader shape of things, the slow extension of influence eastward across the river valleys. To the north and northeast, the tradition speaks of engagements with the Aramaean kingdoms, those prosperous and well-organized city-states and coalitions that controlled the lands we might today call southern Syria. The kingdom centered on Damascus was not yet the power it would later become, and there were other Aramaean principalities, Zobah, Maacah, Beth-Rehob, whose relationships with David's expanding kingdom were defined by a shifting mixture of conflict, tribute, and diplomatic accommodation. The account tells of a significant confrontation with Hadadezer of Zobah, described as a king of considerable regional standing, and the tradition records that David's forces prevailed in this engagement, capturing soldiers and equipment and extracting from the region a flow of tribute that would help sustain the elaborating apparatus of the Jerusalem court. Whether these accounts capture a single decisive campaign or compress several generations of fluctuating relationships into a more dramatic narrative shape, it is difficult now to say with certainty, and historians continue to weigh the textual evidence against what archaeology can and cannot confirm. What does seem clear, or at least consistent across different layers of the tradition, is that by the middle years of David's reign, Jerusalem was receiving tribute and diplomatic attention from a wide arc of neighbors, that the kingdom had become something more than a hill country chieftaincy, something more than a loose confederation of tribes held together by the memory of shared ancestry and the urgency of shared threat. It was becoming, in the language of its own time, a real political entity with a capital, an administration, a standing army, a network of relationships extending far beyond the valleys of Judah and Benjamin. And with those relationships came the texture of diplomacy, which in the ancient world was conducted through gifts and marriages and strategic alliances sealed by the exchange of craftsmen and timber and horses and gold. The tradition records a warm relationship with Hiram of Tyre, the Phoenician king whose city-state along the northern coast controlled the great cedar forests of Lebanon and possessed craftsmen of extraordinary skill in wood and stone and metal. It is said that Hiram sent cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons to David, helping to build the structures that would begin to give Jerusalem the appearance of a royal city, and that this relationship was one of genuine mutual warmth and practical benefit, a partnership between two capable men whose kingdoms needed different things from each other and found in that difference a comfortable complementarity. The cedar would later be remembered most for what Solomon built with it, but the tradition suggests that the relationship itself was first established in David's time, the timber already beginning to arrive, the smell of Lebanon's forests drifting faintly into the hill country air. There is also the account of David's treatment of Mephibosheth, the lame son of Jonathan, brought to the royal table and given the lands of his grandfather Saul, a gesture that belongs partly to personal loyalty and grief, to the love David bore Jonathan, but also to the political logic of keeping the remnants of the old Saulite house close and visible and provided for, where they could not easily become the focus of rival claims. It is a small detail in the larger story, but it speaks to something in the way the tradition imagines David governing, with an eye always on both the human and the political dimensions of each decision, understanding that the two could rarely be fully separated. The shape that this Middle Kingdom took, stretching from the desert edges of the south, through the hill country to the Jordan Valley, and across toward the coastal plains, with tributary relationships extending further still in several directions, has been described by later readers as an empire, though that word carries connotations of Rome and Assyria that may not sit perfectly on what was, in its own terms, something more modest and more personal. It was a kingdom sustained by the energy and reputation of one man, held together by loyalty and fear and genuine admiration in roughly equal measure, and its borders were less fixed lines on a map than zones of influence and relationship that rippled outward from Jerusalem like rings in water around a stone. At the center of it all, in the lamplight of the palace that cedar and skill had raised on the old Jebusite hill, David received his generals and his tribute bearers and his foreign emissaries, heard the reports from the garrison commanders and the messengers from Joab's camp before Rabbah, managed the daily business of a kingdom that was still new enough to feel provisional, still young enough to carry within it the memory of the wilderness years and the hills of Judah and the long open pastures above Bethlehem. The lamps burned through the night in those council chambers, it is said, and the decisions made in their flickering warmth would shape the lives of thousands across the whole arc of the southern Levant. It was a reign reaching its fullness, its middle power, its longest shadow, and like all things at their fullest extension, it carried within it, quietly, invisibly, the first intimations of what comes next. But that is for another night, and for now the lamplight holds, warm and steady, and the city rests in its ancient stones. And there is nothing required of you but to let the weight of the day dissolve gently, to breathe slowly with the rhythm of the hills, and to rest. The city was quiet in the late afternoon heat, the way ancient cities sometimes grow still between the rhythms of the day when the work of morning has finished and the cooler labors of evening have not yet begun. Jerusalem breathed slowly in those hours, the stones of its walls holding the warmth they had gathered since sunrise, the narrow ways between its buildings falling into shade. It is in one of those suspended, heavy-aired afternoons, according to the account that has come down to us, that the story takes one of its most enduring and most sorrowful turns. The tradition places David on the roof of his palace, walking in the way that kings and wealthy households sometimes did in the ancient Near East, where flat rooftops served as cool terraces in the last warmth of the day, places to breathe the higher air and look out across a city that had become entirely his own. From such a height, he would have seen the tiled and thatched rooftops of Jerusalem spreading below him, the walls dropping away toward the valleys, the cooking fires not yet lit, the whole city in its amber afternoon suspension. And it is from that vantage, the account tells us, that he saw Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, bathing, an ordinary act of domestic life taking place in an ordinary courtyard below, entirely innocent in itself, as every day is the city around it. What follows in the tradition is narrated with a directness that ancient texts rarely spare. David inquired after her. She was brought to him. She was the wife of one of his own soldiers, a man named Uriah, identified in the account as a Hittite, a reminder that the kingdom David had built was a composite world, drawing in peoples of different origins under a single administration, men who served in his armies and households from the wider Near Eastern mosaic of the Iron Age Levant. Uriah was away at war, at the siege of Rabbah, far to the east. The account does not soften what happened next. David slept with Bathsheba, and she conceived. Historians and scholars have written at length about this passage, noting that the text itself offers no softening, no flattery, no attempt to excuse. Whatever one makes of the theological dimensions, the account functions as a stark piece of narrative honesty about the nature of unchecked power, the kind of honesty that is, in fact, relatively rare in the royal inscriptions and court documents of the ancient Near East, where kings were more typically portrayed as faultless instruments of divine will. That this tradition survived, was preserved, was woven into the central story of Israel's greatest king, is itself something scholars find significant. The crisis deepened when David learned of the pregnancy. The account describes him attempting to arrange the situation quietly, calling Uriah back from the siege on the pretext of a report, suggesting he go home to his wife, which would have obscured the child's parentage. But Uriah, the account tells us with a kind of quiet admiration, refused. He would not go to his house, would not eat and drink in comfort, while the ark and the soldiers of Israel were camped in the open field. The code of warrior conduct in this period, the solidarity expected of a soldier with his comrades in the field, was something Uriah held to with a seriousness that David in that moment did not. David even had him stay an extra night, had him eat and drink at the royal table until he was somewhat drunk. And still, Uriah did not go home. What David arranged next, the account narrates without flinching. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield, carrying a letter to his own commander, Joab, a letter instructing Joab to place Uriah at the front of the fiercest fighting, and then to withdraw from him so that he would be struck down. The letter was, in effect, Uriah's death warrant, and the man carried it himself without knowing. Joab carried out the order. Uriah was killed, and after a period of mourning, David took Bathsheba as his wife, and she bore him a son. The account then records one of the most quietly powerful moments in the entire narrative of David's life, and one that has no real parallel in the royal literature of neighboring ancient Near Eastern cultures. The tradition says that a prophet named Nathan came to the king, and Nathan told him a story, a parable, the kind of indirect speech that the ancient world sometimes used to speak truth to power when direct speech might be dangerous. In Nathan's parable, a rich man with many flocks wanted to prepare a meal for a guest, but instead of taking from his own abundant herds, he took the single beloved lamb of a poor man, a lamb that had lived in the poor man's house and eaten from his table and drunk from his cup and slept in his arms like a daughter. David's response, according to the account, was immediate and fierce. He declared that the man in the parable deserved to die, that he should restore the lamb fourfold, because he had no pity. And Nathan's reply, 3 words in the Hebrew tradition that scholars have noted for their devastating simplicity, was, "You are the man." The confrontation that follows is rendered in the account as a full reckoning, Nathan speaking aloud the shape of what David had done, the gift of the kingdom, the gift of houses and wives, and the act of contempt by which he had taken the wife of Uriah and arranged Uriah's death. The word the tradition uses is precise and unsparing. What is remarkable, and what generations of readers across very different traditions have returned to, is the account of David's response. He did not have Nathan executed, as other ancient kings of the period might well have done to a man who spoke so directly against royal conduct. He did not deny what was said. The account records simply that David said, "I have sinned against the Lord." Whether one reads this in a theological frame or a purely historical one, the moment carries weight, the image of a king who had reached the pinnacle of power, who had conquered cities and commanded armies, sitting before a prophet and not deflecting. The consequences in the narrative are long and specific. The child born to Bathsheba became ill, and the account records David fasting and lying on the ground through the nights of the child's illness. When the child died, David rose, washed, changed his clothes, and went to eat, bewildering his servants, who had expected deeper, louder grief. His explanation has been remembered and quoted for centuries. While the child lived, there was reason to fast and pray. Now, he could not bring the child back. There is something in that moment that feels less like the divine punishment of a parable, and more like a man confronting irreversible loss with a kind of exhausted, clear-eyed stillness. Bathsheba conceived again, and the child born from that later union was named Solomon. And in one strand of the tradition, he was also called Jedediah, a name meaning beloved of God, or beloved of the Lord, though historians note that the exact significance of the double naming and its original context remain matters of scholarly discussion. What is clear is that the relationship between David and Bathsheba continued, that Solomon would grow into a figure of enormous importance in the traditions of the kingdom, and that his mother's presence in the court would matter in the years of succession and negotiations still to come. But the shadow the account speaks of did not lift quickly. The tradition is explicit that the troubles which followed, the violence within the royal family, the fracturing of loyalty, the grief that gathered around David's household in the years ahead, were understood in the ancient narrative as flowing from this moment, the way a stone dropped into water sends circles outward long after the hand that dropped it has withdrawn. The story does not ask for simple conclusions. It holds the complexity of a man who could write poetry of extraordinary tenderness, who could inspire loyalty so fierce that men would risk their lives for a cup of water from his preferred well, and who could also, in an afternoon of unchecked wanting, set in motion events he could not undo. Jerusalem would have glowed in its cooking firelight that evening, as it did every evening, the smell of bread and pressed oil drifting up through the city's terraced buildings, the sound of animals settling, of water being carried, of voices in the ordinary conversations of a people living their lives around and beneath the decisions of the powerful. The fires burned in their usual places, steady and unhurried, and the city did not know yet what the days ahead would bring: the rebellion of a son, the flight of a king, the long and sorrowing road back. That road will wait for the next evening's story, resting now with the coals. The lamps were still burning in Jerusalem when the word came. It is said that the messengers arrived breathless, their sandals worn from the road, their faces carrying that particular hollowness that belongs to bearers of news too heavy to set down gently. And the news they carried was this: that Absalom, the king's own son, the one whose beauty the ancient texts describe with an almost wondering admiration, whose long hair was spoken of as something remarkable, even among the people of a land where such things were noticed, that Absalom had declared himself king in Hebron, the very city where David himself had first been anointed, and that the hearts of the men of Israel, as the account puts it with its particular bruising directness, had gone after him. There is something in that detail that repays slow consideration, lying here in the quiet of the night. Hebron, not some distant foreign city, not some rebel stronghold carved out of unfamiliar territory, but Hebron, ancient warm-stoned Hebron seated in its bowl of southern hills, the first city that had ever called David its king. The choice, the tradition suggests, was deliberate. Absalom understood the weight of sacred places. He understood, too, the grammar of legitimacy, and he had spent years learning it, years of watching his father govern, years of nursing a grievance that had begun in the aftermath of a violence done to his sister, and left, in his view, inadequately answered. Historians and scholars who study this period note that the narrative leading to the rebellion is long and tangled, rooted in the complex and often anguished family life of the royal household, in the aftermath of events that had already cast a shadow over the later years of David's reign. The account does not present Absalom as simply a villain. It presents him as a man of extraordinary appearance and political instinct, one who had spent 4 years, according to the tradition, standing at the city gate, greeting petitioners, embracing them, telling them that their causes were just, and that if only he were judge in the land, their matters would be heard. The storytellers record this with a kind of cool precision. He stole the hearts of Israel, they say, and the phrase carries in it both the cunning of the act and the genuine hunger of the people for something they felt they were not receiving from the palace above them. And so when the messengers came and the lamps were still burning, David had to decide. The account tells us that he decided with a swiftness that still carries something startling about it, not to defend the city, not to call his guard to the walls, but to leave, to take his household, his servants, his loyal men, and to walk out of Jerusalem before Absalom arrived, before the city became a battlefield, before the stones of the place he had made his own were stained with the blood of a civil war fought street by street. The text records him saying, with a quietness that seems almost to belong to a man much older than his years, that they should flee, or else none of them would escape. He was choosing the open wilderness over the walled city, the hard road over the defended palace, and it is difficult, reading the account at this distance of centuries, to know entirely what moved him. Perhaps it was military prudence. Perhaps it was something older and softer than that, a reluctance to see his city burn for the sake of his throne. The procession that left Jerusalem that day is described in the tradition with a kind of slow, aching detail. David walking barefoot, his head covered, ascending the Mount of Olives to the east of the city, weeping as he went. The people with him, weeping. The Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant coming out with him. And David, the account says, sending it back into the city because the city was where it belonged, and because he would trust to whatever came next, rather than carry the sacred object into the uncertainty of the road. It is one of those moments in the narrative that seems to gather a great deal of light around it, though the light is the light of grief rather than of triumph. A king walking away from his own city, a father walking away from his son who has taken what is his, the olive trees on the hillside standing as they always had, silver green in whatever season this was, indifferent and ancient and still. The wilderness received him, as it always had received those who came to it with nothing but their feet and whatever they carried inside them. The Judean desert to the east, that landscape of pale, ridged rock falling toward the deep cleft of the Jordan Valley, is not a landscape that offers comfort, but it offers in its way a kind of fierce clarity. David had known it in younger days, in the years of his flight from Saul, and now in older years he knew it again. The account records encounters along the road that are themselves quietly remarkable. A man named Shimei from the house of Saul, who came out cursing David, throwing dust and stones, shouting that the disaster was a just repayment for the blood of Saul's house. And David's men wanting to silence him, and David refusing, saying that perhaps the Lord had told him to curse, and that his own son was seeking his life, and what then was a man of Benjamin to him? There is in this a kind of exhausted, weathered humility that sits differently on the David of this late part of the story than on the confident young man who had come out of the hills of Judah so many years before. What followed, the account tells us, was military as well as personal. David gathered himself, his loyal commanders, men who had been with him for decades, who had crossed deserts and fought wars, and built something together in Jerusalem. These men were still his. Joab was still his, and when the battle came, it came in a forest east of the Jordan, in a place called the Forest of Ephraim, and the account records that Absalom's forces were defeated there, and that the forest itself devoured more men that day than the sword. The beautiful son, riding his mule, caught by his hair in the branches of a great oak tree. This is the image the tradition gives us, strange and arresting and somehow deeply quietly sad. And Joab, who did not share his king's reluctance, who never had, putting an end to the rebellion in a way that David had explicitly asked him not to, because for all of it, for all the stolen hearts in the Hebron declaration and the long roads through the wilderness, Absalom was still his son. The lament that the account gives David at the news of Absalom's death is one of the most simply stated expressions of grief in the ancient literature. My son, Absalom, would God I had died for thee. It does not elaborate, it does not explain, it only repeats the name, the way grief repeats the name of the one it has lost, turning the syllables over and over, as though they might eventually yield up some comfort that syllables simply do not contain. Joab, practical and unsentimental as always, told the king to stop weeping, told him that his mourning was turning the victory into a defeat in the eyes of his men, and David, the account tells us, composed himself and went to sit in the gate. But the grief had been real. The man who returned toward Jerusalem was not the same man who had left it barefoot and weeping on the eastern hill. The return itself is described in the tradition with a gentle, careful attention to reconciliation. The men of Judah coming to meet the king at the Jordan, the crossing of the river, the slow procession back toward the city. Shimei, who had cursed him, now coming to beg forgiveness, crossing the Jordan with 1,000 men of Benjamin, and David sparing him. Old loyalties being tested and rebuilt, one by one, as the road led back through the landscape toward the place of limestone and lamplight and long memory that was Jerusalem. The city received him again. The hills held the sound of the return as they had held the sound of the departure. The same wind through the same stones, the same terrace slopes falling away to the south toward Bethlehem where all of this had once, long ago, begun. The lamps were lit again in the palace, the fire was tended, and the king, older now, more worn, carrying everything that had happened in the lines of his face and the quietness of his manner was home. There is one more chapter in this long, layered story, the last light gathering around a life that had moved, in its strange and human way, from the shepherd's hillside to the throne of a kingdom. And that chapter waits for you, patient and unhurried, whenever you are ready to receive it, soft as the flame of a lamp burning low in the hour before dawn. The fire has burned low now, and what remains of it glows with a patient amber warmth, the kind of light that does not demand anything of you, that asks only that you rest in its presence and let the darkness at the edges be soft and kind. It is the kind of light that has always existed at the end of long days, in every age and every land, the light that gathers the scattered hours back into a single quiet point and holds them there gently until sleep comes. And so we return one final time to a world that is very old and very far away, and yet somehow, in the way of all stories that have been told and retold across so many centuries, not entirely distant. We return to the hills, to the wind moving through dry grasses, to the smell of stone warmed by sun and cooled by evening, to a landscape that shaped one of the ancient world's most remembered figures, a shepherd boy from the hill country of Judah, whose story has traveled, in one form or another, across nearly 3,000 years. Let us walk back through it slowly, the way you might walk back through a house you have loved and are leaving, touching the walls gently, pausing in each room, not to relive everything, but simply to say farewell to it with some tenderness. It began according to the tradition that has come down to us in the hills south of Jerusalem, in a region of limestone ridges and terrace slopes and small stone villages clinging to the high ground. The landscape of Judah in the Iron Age was a particular kind of world, bounded by the dry breath of the desert to the east, by the gentler coastal plains to the west, by the long rhythms of rain and drought that governed everything, every planting and every harvest, every decision about where to graze the flocks and when to move on. Into this world David was said to have been born, the youngest son of a man named Jesse, in the town of Bethlehem, a settlement of no great consequence in the wider world of the ancient Near East, a place of small fields and communal wells, and the slow, reliable work of pastoral life. He is remembered as a shepherd first, before any throne, before any battle, before any palace or court or royal city. There were the hillsides and the flocks, the long solitary hours under an enormous sky. It is said that he learned patience in those pastures, the patient attention of someone who watches and listens and waits, who knows the land by the sound of its wind and the color of its clouds, who sleeps outdoors and wakes with the stars still showing. The tradition holds that he was already forming in those quiet years in ways that neither he nor anyone around him could have seen clearly. The pastures were his first education, and they were a thorough one. Then came the anointing, that strange and private ceremony described in the account, in which the prophet Samuel came to Bethlehem and passed over Jesse's older, stronger sons one by one and asked for the youngest, the one still out with the sheep, the one no one had thought to summon. Historians debate the historical nature of such traditions, and the account marks itself even within its own telling as something hidden and interior, a private consecration that left no outward change, no crown, no announcement. The boy returned to his flocks. The hills looked the same, and yet the story goes, something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in the way that the deepest changes often do. The world was in motion around him. The kingdom of Saul, the first Israelite king, was struggling against the pressures of the Philistine cities along the coast, those well-organized, iron-equipped powers who controlled the lowland passes and pushed steadily eastward into the highlands. It was a time of real geopolitical tension in the southern Levant, a small kingdom trying to hold its shape against neighbors who were, in many respects, more technologically advanced. Into this world David came, first as a musician, his lyre carried into the troubled court of Saul, his music said to bring some ease to a king who was suffering in ways the ancient texts describe with a strange, melancholy tenderness. And then as a soldier, and then as something more complicated, a beloved figure who became a threatening one simply by being too good at the things that kings needed done. The Valley of Elah spreads out in the western foothills even now, a wide, quiet lowland where grain once grew, and where the archaeology tells us Philistine and Israelite territories pressed against each other in those Iron Age centuries. The great tradition of David and the Philistine giant has been told in so many forms across so many ages that it has taken on the quality of something archetypal, and perhaps that is partly why it has survived so well. Whatever its deepest historical layers, it carries something true about the nature of courage and the unexpected shape that bravery sometimes takes, small and unheroic looking, armed with what it has rather than what it wishes it had. The years of flight through the wilderness were hard years by any measure. The Judean desert is not a comfortable place. Its chalk hills and dry wadis and sudden drops toward the salt shores of the Dead Sea make for a landscape of real harshness. And yet David is said to have moved through it with a kind of fluid knowledge, hiding in caves, gathering followers, protecting villages along the edges of the settled land, negotiating constantly between loyalty and survival. The account of his time even among the Philistines, taking shelter at the court of Achish of Gath, is one of the stranger passages of his story, a reminder that ancient politics were rarely simple, and that survival in the margins of power required a certain moral flexibility that the tradition does not pretend away. Then the death of Saul on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, and the lament poetry attributed to David, those spare and sorrowful lines that read, even across the distance of millennia, like genuine grief. Whether David composed them in the form we have them, historians cannot say with certainty, but that grief is recorded, and the tradition treats it as real, and something about the care of the words suggests that whoever shaped them understood mourning from the inside. Hebron came first, the ancient city in the highlands of Judah, where David ruled over his own tribe before the long process of unification brought the northern territories into a fragile, negotiated whole. The archaeology of Hebron and of the early Iron Age highlands is still being worked through by scholars, and many details of this period remain genuinely uncertain. But the broad shape of the tradition, a regional leader slowly consolidating power across a divided landscape, fits recognizably into the patterns of ancient Near Eastern political history. And then Jerusalem, the old Jebusite hilltop, taken and renamed and made into something new, a capital that belonged to no single tribe because it had been won by the king himself, a city of stone and shadow and singular position, high enough to see far, surrounded on three sides by deep valleys, a place that felt, the tradition suggests, chosen as much as conquered. The ark came there, carried with ceremony and celebration, and the account tells us, with a joy that overcame all royal dignity, David dancing before it in the street, unguarded and entirely himself. What that moment meant in its original religious and political context is something scholars continue to examine. But the image has endured. The king without his armor, moving through the city he had made his own, in something that looked very much like wonder. The later years were darker. The story of Bathsheba and its terrible unfolding, the rebuke of Nathan that the tradition records with such directness, the long consequences that moved through the royal household, like a slow river finding all the low places, the rebellion of his own son Absalom, the flight from Jerusalem on foot, the king weeping as he climbed the Mount of Olives and looked back at the city he had built. These are the shadows of the story, and the tradition does not soften them. It holds the whole of the man, the shepherd and the warrior and the poet and the king and the father who failed, and the fugitive who returned, and it holds all of it without resolving it neatly, because life in the ancient world, as in every world, was not neat. What remains after all of it is something like the glow of a fire that has been burning for a very long time and has settled now into its truest warmth, not the high bright flame of its beginning, but the deep lasting heat at its core. A shepherd who became a king, a poet who wrote in grief and gratitude, a figure whose world was small by modern measure, a few hundred miles of hill country and desert and coastal plain, and yet whose story somehow kept going, kept being told, kept finding new listeners in new ages, the way certain fires keep their warmth long after the last log has burned down. The hills of Judah are still there. The terraces are still cut into the limestone. The wind still moves through the same valleys at evening, carrying the same dry warmth and the same faint coolness underneath it. The stars over the Judean wilderness are very bright on clear nights, as they have always been, and somewhere in all of that old, patient landscape, the The story rests, settled into the stone and the soil, no longer urgent, no longer seeking anything, simply present, the way old things are present when they have endured long enough to become part of the land itself. Let the fire be low now. Let the warmth be enough. Let whatever you are carrying from this day grow lighter, and set itself down gently at the edge of the dark, and wait for morning without any worry at all. You have traveled far tonight, through hills and courts and wildernesses and cities, through a life that was long ago, and yet somehow still vivid. Rest now in the quiet that follows a good story well told. Let your breathing slow, and your thoughts soften, and the lamplight of this ancient world grow dim behind your eyes, steady and warm and fading, as all good fires do, into the deep and restful dark.